The unknown neighbor. I moved into a new neighborhood about 6 months ago. It was my first place on my own, a cozy little house on a quiet street. I'd recently started a new job in the city and wanted to be closer, so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to find somewhere nice. The area seemed ideal: friendly neighbors, well-kept lawns, and a sense of safety that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was thrilled to finally have a place that I could call mine, but I guess I was naive. The first few weeks went by smoothly. I'd come home after work, make myself dinner, and settle in with a book or TV show. I didn't interact much with my neighbors except for a few polite hellos. There was nothing strange or alarming at first, until one morning I noticed the front gate open. It was odd because I always made a point to close it. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had blown it open. Then, one night, I saw him. I was washing the dishes when I glanced out the window and saw a man standing on the sidewalk across the street. He wasn't doing anything, just staring at my house. I remember thinking it was strange, but he left after a few minutes. I told myself he was probably just passing by. Things started getting weird after that. I came home one evening and found the back door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before leaving for work. Maybe I had forgotten, I thought, trying to calm myself. But then, small things began to go missing. A cup from the kitchen, a book I'd been reading. The TV would be on when I hadn't touched it. Lights flickered when I knew I'd turned them off. The paranoia set in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my house. I decided to install extra locks and bought a small security camera for the front door. At first, the footage didn't show anything unusual. But one evening, I caught a shadow moving past the door. I froze as I watched, rewinding the footage, but it was just darkness. I called the property management company, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a glitch or an animal. The following morning, I found muddy footprints in the backyard, leading up to my bedroom window. Panic washed over me. I called the police, but they didn't find anything. No one had broken in, and there were no signs of forced entry. They said it might have been someone passing through the neighborhood. I didn't believe them. I knew someone was watching me. From then on, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I started noticing more things missing: my favorite coffee mug, a pair of gloves, my keys, which I later found inside the refrigerator. One night, I heard a faint knocking on the front door. My heart raced as I crept over and peeked through the peephole. No one was there. But then, a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, came from somewhere outside my bedroom window. I couldn't make out the words, but it made my skin crawl. I tried to explain what was happening to a colleague at work. She looked concerned but suggested I might be overreacting. Maybe it was just stress from moving and starting a new job, she said. But I knew something wasn't right. One night, I saw him again, standing by my bedroom window. I froze, unable to move. He stood there for what felt like hours before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I found a single, muddy handprint on the glass. I called the police again, but they didn't find any fingerprints. Nothing. I felt trapped and alone. Then I found the note. It was slipped under my door, a piece of paper with messy handwriting. "I like watching you sleep." My hands trembled as I read it. Whoever it was, they were close, too close. I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried talking to a neighbor, an older woman who had lived there for years. She mentioned that the previous tenant moved out suddenly, but didn't know why. Her vague answers made me even more suspicious. I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights, just to clear my head. But when I came back, my house was a mess. Every drawer, every cabinet had been open. Items were scattered everywhere. The locks were scratched and looked tampered with. I frantically checked the camera footage. Everything was normal until around 3 a.m., when there was a sudden glitch. The door opened by itself and a shadowy figure stepped inside. His face was obscured. He moved slowly through the house, lingering in my bedroom, standing over my bed, for hours. I confronted the property management company again. They promised to change the locks, but I didn't trust them anymore. I felt eyes on me wherever I went, like I was never really alone. One night, I heard someone whispering my name through the bedroom window. This time, I grabbed a knife and rushed outside, but no one was there. I found fresh footprints in the mud leading back to the house next door. I decided to investigate. As I crept closer to the neighboring house, I saw a shadow move inside. My heart pounded as I stepped forward. Suddenly, a light flicked on, and someone peered through the blinds. It was the man from before. He grinned at me before the light went off, leaving me alone in the dark. Shaking, I ran back to my house and locked myself inside. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the house next door was dark and empty. They didn't find anyone and suggested I might be imagining things due to stress and lack of sleep. I showed them the footprints, but they just looked at me with pity. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. "You're not alone." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a stranger outside, it was someone much closer. I decided to leave the house for good. I packed a small bag and was about to walk out the door when I heard a faint creak behind me. I turned slowly, staring into the empty darkness of the hallway. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt a presence watching me. Shaking, I locked the door behind me, praying that I was finally escaping. But as I walked away, I knew deep down that the danger wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to whoever or whatever was watching me. The Stranded Driver. I never thought I'd be sharing my story online like this, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. I'm Jack, 32 years old, work in logistics, and I drive a lot for my job. Usually, I stick to highways and avoid lonely back roads, but one night, I found myself doing just that. The events that unfolded are still hard to believe, but they happened. I swear they did. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m. I was driving through some rural stretch of highway, trying to shave off time on my way back home. I remember feeling unusually restless that night. Something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. My gas was lower than I'd expected, so I figured I'd stop at the next station I saw. The road stretched out endlessly in the darkness, my headlights barely piercing through the night. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. The first time, I brushed it off, but then I saw it again, and again. It didn't make sense. I was miles away from any town or service station. Still, I kept driving, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger. Then I spotted someone in the distance. A lone figure standing by the roadside, thumb out. Against all my instincts, I slowed down. That's where I made the worst mistake of my life, I realize now. The guy looked young, maybe late 20s, with messy hair, a dirty hoodie, and jeans. He was carrying a small, beat-up backpack. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. He asked if I was heading toward the next town. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to say no, but I found myself nodding and unlocking the passenger door. We settled into a tense silence as he climbed in. He didn't smell great, like stale sweat and something else I couldn't place. He stared out at the window, barely moving, and I tried to focus on the road. After a few minutes, he started speaking. "What made you stop for me?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Are you running from something?" I tried to laugh it off, saying something about being a good Samaritan, but he didn't respond, just kept staring out the window. A few more miles passed, and he finally turned to look at me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, eyes locking onto mine. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I tried to brush it off as him being tired or anxious, but then he added, "Do you think anyone would notice if you disappeared out here?" My stomach dropped. I forced a laugh, but it came out choked. I told him I needed to stop at a gas station up ahead, trying to keep my voice steady. He just nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. We kept driving, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. He started muttering about signs I hadn't seen and roads I'd missed, like he knew the area better than I did. When I glanced in the mirror, I swear I saw that figure again, the one I'd seen standing by the road earlier. Finally, we reached a gas station, a rundown place with flickering lights and no other cars in sight. I pulled up and turned to the hitchhiker, trying to sound casual. "This is where you get off." He didn't move, just stared at me with that same unsettling smile. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll see you soon." He stepped out and walked a few paces, but he didn't head toward the gas station. Instead, he just stood there, staring at me as I got out to refuel. When I turned back to the pump after checking the price, he was gone. Vanished. There were no sounds of footsteps, no shadows, nothing. Just gone. Panicking, I ran inside and asked the old man behind the counter if he'd seen where the guy went. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy and said no one else had come by all night. My heart pounded in my ears as I realized how alone I was out there. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words tumbled out incoherently. The old man just shrugged and said, "You know, someone else said they picked up a man like that around here weeks ago, but they never made it to town." I felt my blood turn to ice. I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher's voice grew tense as I described the hitchhiker, asking if I could stay put until a deputy arrived. I agreed, feeling the walls close in around me. While waiting, I noticed a bulletin board covered in missing person flyers. One stood out, a young man with messy hair wearing a hoodie. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. The flyer was dated 3 weeks ago. Before I could process what I was seeing, my phone buzzed. I looked down and felt the ground sway beneath me. A text from an unknown number, a photo of my car, parked right outside the gas station, taken just seconds ago. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one outside, no movement, nothing but the empty highway stretching into the darkness. A deputy arrived after what felt like hours. I tried explaining everything, but I must have sounded insane. He searched the area and, of course, found no sign of the hitchhiker. He suggested I was tired and maybe imagined it all. I knew I hadn't, but what could I say? Driving home felt surreal. Every shadow, every flicker of headlights made my heart jump. I pulled over several times just to breathe, convinced I was being followed. When I finally made it home, I noticed something on my dashboard. A folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. "I told you I'd see you soon." Back in my apartment, I locked every door, checked every window. Sleep was impossible. I started searching online and found a Reddit thread about the missing hitchhiker. People claimed to have seen him in other places, gas stations, rest stops. Every encounter ended the same way, with the hitchhiker disappearing, leaving behind nothing but fear. I shared my own story but decided not to check for responses. As I shut my laptop, my phone buzzed again. Another text. "I told you I'd see you soon. Look outside." Heart pounding, I glanced out the window. There was no one there. But I knew I was being watched. What should I do now? I used to think of that little cafe on 8th Street as my safe place. Every day after work, I'd stop by, grab my usual, a cappuccino with a hint of cinnamon, and sit in the far corner, away from the windows. It was my routine, something that helped me unwind after a long day. The baristas knew me well enough to start my order as soon as they saw me. It wasn't a busy spot, just a quiet little nook where regulars and passersby would come and go. At first, I didn't think much of the man who started showing up around the same time I did. He was just there. I'd catch him sitting at a table in the middle, facing me. He never had a drink or food, just his eyes fixed on me. I told myself it was nothing, just one of those things you notice when you spend too much time in the same place. One night, I stayed later than usual, finishing up some emails on my laptop. As I gathered my things, I glanced up and caught his reflection in the window. He was staring directly at me, not looking away when I met his gaze. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off as my imagination getting the better of me. After that, I started noticing him more often. He was always there, always watching. It went from being an occasional sight to a constant presence. I thought maybe I should switch cafes, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Besides, he never did anything, just sat there. One rainy evening, I decided to leave the cafe earlier. As I walked down the wet, empty street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. It was probably just someone heading in the same direction, I thought. But when I reached my apartment building and looked back again, I saw a shadowy figure standing under a lamppost at the end of the street. It was too far to make out, but something about the posture seemed familiar. I quickly slipped inside, heart racing, and locked the door behind me. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I tried to stick to my regular routine, pretending that nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, and a couple of times I thought I saw him, outside my office building, at the grocery store. I was driving myself crazy. A friend noticed how tense I was and asked if I was okay. I almost told her, but what could I say? That some guy from the cafe was making me uncomfortable. That wasn't enough to get anyone's attention, not really. I felt stupid even thinking about it. Then a note appeared on my windshield one morning. 3 simple words. Nice to see you. It was unsigned. My heart dropped. That's when I knew it wasn't just in my head. I avoided the cafe entirely after that. I started changing my routes to work, taking longer detours to throw off anyone who might be following me. It didn't help. I'd still spot him, always at a distance, always watching. I felt trapped, constantly on edge. One evening, I saw him lingering outside my apartment building again. It was the last straw. I marched up to him, heart pounding, and demanded to know what he wanted. He didn't say a word, just turned and walked away as if I hadn't spoken. I stood there, feeling helpless and furious. I called the police, but without any physical threat or evidence, there was nothing they could do. My friends started avoiding me because of my growing paranoia. I became a shut-in, barely leaving my apartment except for work. I couldn't concentrate. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, suffocated by fear. Finally, I decided I had to leave. I packed up some essentials and moved in with a friend for a while. On my last night in the apartment, I heard a knock on my door around midnight. My heart stopped. I crept to the peephole and froze. It was him, standing there, holding up a small box. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. No trace of him anywhere. They checked the box. Inside was a single key, my key, the one I'd lost months ago. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. He'd been inside my apartment. He'd had access all this time. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. As I drove through the empty city streets, my phone rang. Unknown number. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. Miss me? A soft male voice. My blood ran cold. I changed my phone number, moved to a different city, and tried to start over. New place, new life. I cut ties with most of my old friends, and for months I stayed hidden, avoiding routines, not letting myself fall into any predictable habits. The fear never completely went away, but I managed. I started going to a support group for people dealing with trauma. It helped, a little. I never told anyone the full story, never mentioned his name. I wasn't even sure if I knew it. One day, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photograph of me at my new workplace, taken from a distance. I stared at it, feeling that old terror flooding back. I considered going to the police again, but I knew what they'd say. What could they do? It was just a photo, just a coincidence, just paranoia. So, I'm packing up again. I don't know where I'll go this time, but I refuse to live in fear anymore. I don't know if I'll ever be safe, or if I'm just doomed to keep running, but one thing's for sure. I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there, waiting for me to let my guard down, because I know I can't hide forever. The night I realized I was being hunted. I always thought I was careful. I lived in a quiet neighborhood just far enough from the city to feel safe, but close enough to not be isolated. I worked a typical 9 to 5 job at an office downtown. My routine was predictable. Take the bus home, get off at the same stop every evening around 7 p.m., and walk the 15 minutes back to my house. It was usually still light out, and I enjoyed those few moments of solitude. I'd listen to podcasts, sometimes hum along to a song. It was my time to unwind. But a few nights ago, I noticed a white van parked at the corner. I'd brushed it off as a neighbor's vehicle or maybe a delivery van. But the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself I was just being paranoid and moved on. Tonight, I saw it again. The same van, in the same spot, just sitting there as I stepped off the bus. My stomach twisted, but I tried to ignore it. I started walking, picking up my pace without making it too obvious. I felt foolish, like I was overreacting to a simple coincidence. But then the van pulled out and began trailing slowly behind me. I kept my eyes straight ahead, willing myself to stay calm. Maybe they were just driving slowly, I thought. But when I turned down a side street, they followed. I veered right at the next intersection. So did they. My heart pounded, and my palms grew slick with sweat. I mentally debated calling a friend, pretending to be on the phone, but I worried it would make me look more vulnerable. I quickened my steps, glancing back discreetly. The van's headlights blinked off, and for a split second, I thought they might have stopped following. But then the van sped up again, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I took another sharp turn, and that's when I saw it. The van's door slid open a few inches. I caught a glimpse of someone inside. I didn't wait to see more. Panicking, I looked around for any escape route and spotted a small house at the end of the street with its porch light on. Without thinking, I sprinted towards it, adrenaline pushing me forward. I banged on the door, my hand trembling so hard I could barely make a fist. "Please, help me! Someone's following me!" I shouted, glancing back to see the van slowing down. A middle-aged man opened the door, his face creased with confusion. I blurted out, "Please, can I use your phone?" He stepped aside to let me in, and relief washed over me for a second. But as I stepped into the dimly lit house, something felt off. The living room was cluttered, like it hadn't been lived in properly for a while. The windows were covered with thick, heavy curtains, and the air smelled faintly sour. The man's expression shifted from surprise to something else, something more calculating. Of course," he said, his voice oddly calm. He handed me an old cordless phone, and I started dialing 911, my hands shaking. "I saw the van too," he added, his tone casual, as if this sort of thing happened all the time. As I held the phone to my ear, my gaze darted around the room. That's when I noticed. The locks on the doors were recently reinforced, and the windows were all bolted shut from the inside. Panic started to creep in again. I glanced at the man. His smile was too fixed, too rehearsed. "Are you alone here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he left the room. When he came back, he was holding a glass of water. "You should sit down. Calm yourself," he said, extending the glass towards me. I stared at it. Tiny white particles floated at the bottom. "What's that?" I managed to ask, my voice wavering. "Just something to help you relax," he replied, his smile widening. My heart dropped. I forced a shaky smile and pretended to take a sip, holding the glass close to my lips. "Actually, I think I'm fine. I should just head home," I said, trying to edge towards the door, but when I turned, I found the front door locked. My pulse raced. He moved closer, his smile now completely gone. "I don't think that's a good idea," he murmured, his voice low. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything. I raised the glass and hurled it at his face. It shattered against his cheek, and I bolted for the door. I heard him shout behind me, felt him grab at my shirt, but I yanked myself free and fumbled with the lock. I managed to throw the door open just as I heard tires crunching on gravel. I looked back through the window. The van had pulled up, its headlights glaring through the darkness. The man's smile returned. "Looks like your ride is here," he whispered. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted across the lawn, hearing his footsteps pounding behind me. The van's driver jumped out, shouting something unintelligible. My only thought was to get away. I spotted a narrow gap in a neighbor's fence and squeezed through, leaving them cursing behind me. I ran blindly through backyards, stumbling over garden tools and bushes. The van's engine roared back to life, and I felt the vibration in my bones as it circled the block, searching for me. I burst out onto a main road, lungs burning, just as a car approached. I waved my arms frantically. "Help, please, help me!" I cried out. The car stopped, and the driver, a woman in her 50s, rolled down the window, looking concerned. I practically threw myself into the back seat. "Please, just drive," I begged. She didn't ask questions. She just drove. As we sped down the road, I tried to explain what happened, my voice choked with sobs. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, her eyes darting nervously. I looked back too, half expecting to see the van's headlights following us. Every shadow, every flicker of light made me jump. Finally, she broke the silence. "It's strange," she said slowly. "I think I saw that van earlier tonight too, driving around this area." My blood ran cold. We reached the police station, and I stumbled inside, explaining everything. The officers nodded, took notes, promised to look into it. But their expressions said it all. They didn't believe me. To them, I was just another hysterical woman. Days later, I still see that van in my nightmares. Every time I'm outside, I feel eyes on me. I'm planning to move, but I can't shake the fear that it's not over. Last night, I got a text from an unknown number. It just said, "Miss you. See you soon." The photographer. I never thought I'd be posting here. I've always been the type to read these stories, never imagining that one day I'd be writing my own. My life was uneventful until it all changed. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. I work a standard 9-to-5 office job and spend my weekends wandering the city, taking photographs as a hobby. That's what makes this whole experience even more disturbing. I'm used to being behind the camera, not in front of it. A few weeks ago, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. People would glance at me for just a second too long, or I'd hear faint footsteps behind me when I knew no one was there. But I brushed it off. Everyone has off days, right? It wasn't until I found the first postcard in my mailbox, a picture of the sunset I'd taken but never shared, that I began to feel that creeping sense of unease. I thought it was weird, but nothing more. I didn't know it was just the beginning. Then, one day, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no markings, just my name printed on it. Inside was a single photograph. It was me, walking through the park I often visit. The angle was perfect, suggesting that whoever took it was only a few feet away. My heart raced as I stared at the image. Someone had been watching me, but I convinced myself it was just a prank. I even asked my friends, but they all swore it wasn't them. The next day, another envelope arrived. This time, the photo was closer, a profile shot of me looking at my phone while sitting on a bench. It was so close I could see the strain lines on my face. I felt exposed. That's when I started to feel real fear. Who would go to such lengths just to take pictures of me? I considered calling the police, but what would I say? Hey, someone's sending me creepy photos of myself? It sounded paranoid. A few days later, I found the third photo. It was taken from the sidewalk outside my house, a clear shot of my front door. My hands were shaking as I held the picture. This person knew where I lived. Panic set in. I rushed out and bought a security system, installing cameras around every corner of my home. For a few days, there were no new photos, and I started to breathe easier, thinking I'd scared them off. Then I received an email from an unknown sender. My blood ran cold as I opened it. It was another photograph, this time taken from inside my living room. The picture showed me standing in front of the camera I had installed. I frantically checked the footage, rewinding hours and hours of recordings, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone entering my house. It was as if the picture had materialized out of thin air. Desperation took over. I contacted the police, and they conducted a thorough search. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of tampering with my cameras. They looked at me with pity, and I knew what they were thinking, another paranoid guy with too much time on his hands. They left without offering much help. I started skipping work, barely eating or sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart pound. Every shadow outside my window sent me into a panic. I was losing control, becoming a prisoner in my own home. Then, one evening, I got another email. This time, it was a video file. The video showed me sleeping, shot from a high angle, an angle I couldn't have captured with my cameras. My breathing was shallow as I watched myself toss and turn. Someone had been in my house, in my room, watching me. That was it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I called a friend and asked to stay at their place for a while. I packed a bag and left the house that night, convinced I was finally out of reach. But the very next morning, another envelope arrived at my friend's house. My friend handed it to me with a puzzled look. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling. The photograph was of me, standing outside my friend's house, staring up at the window I had just been sleeping behind. I couldn't remember being outside. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I snapped. I accused my friend of being involved, convinced they were playing some twisted game with me. We argued, and they kicked me out, telling me to get help. Alone again, I returned to my house, determined to confront whoever was doing this. I searched every inch of the place, tearing up floorboards, ripping open walls. Nothing. Finally, I heard a faint creaking sound from the attic. My pulse pounded in my ears as I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I forced myself up the narrow stairs, sweat dripping down my face. The attic was empty, except for a small envelope lying on the dusty floor. Inside was a USB drive. With shaking hands, I plugged it into my laptop. Folder after folder of photographs appeared, pictures of me from years ago, at work, at home, even from other places I'd lived before. This wasn't recent. This person had been following me for years, documenting my life. I fled the house and called the police again. This time, they took me more seriously, but it didn't matter. Despite all the evidence, they couldn't identify the stalker. I quit my job, stopped talking to everyone. I became a shut-in, haunted by the images I couldn't get out of my head. Then, one night, as I was sifting through the photos again, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss me? I moved to a new city, changed my name, tried to start over. But every time I step outside, I feel eyes on me. Every time I get mail, I hesitate, expecting another photograph. Then, just last week, a familiar plain envelope arrived. I opened it, hands trembling. It was a photograph of me, standing on the porch of my new house. The nightmare isn't over, and I don't think it ever will be. The Forgotten Passenger. I don't usually post on here, but I feel like I need to share this. I've always considered myself a rational person. Ghost stories and urban legends never bothered me. I work late nights in the city, and the last train home has become a sort of routine for me. There's something comforting about the empty train cars after a long day. No noisy passengers, no rush. But lately, things haven't been normal. Maybe it's the exhaustion, or maybe I'm just overworked, but I've started noticing small things that don't add up. Like last week, there was this man who seemed to vanish when the train went through a tunnel. I saw his reflection in the window 1 second, and then he was gone. I brushed it off, thinking I'd just zoned out or something, but I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. Tonight, though, was different. It started off like any other late-night ride. I was alone in my car, scrolling through my phone, when a man boarded at the next station. He was wearing a heavy coat and a dark beanie, even though it was warm out. He sat diagonally across from me, keeping his head down. He never made eye contact, just muttered to himself, too low for me to hear. I told myself to ignore him. Weird people show up on late trains all the time. I went back to my phone, but I could still hear his voice, just under the hum of the train. It made my skin crawl. When the train entered a long, dark tunnel, I felt a sudden pressure in my chest. The lights flickered, and I heard it, a scream, faint and muffled, like it was coming from far away. I looked up. No one else reacted. No one but the man who was now gripping his seat, staring at the floor. His muttering got louder, more frantic. They know. Can't escape. Can't escape. I couldn't stand it anymore. I decided to move to the next car, but as soon as I stood up, he stopped talking. He looked straight at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I froze. He didn't say anything, just watched as the train rattled through the dark. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to step forward. And then, the train burst out of the tunnel. The lights steadied. I looked back, and he was gone. The seat where he'd been sitting was empty. I stood there, staring. I must have looked crazy, standing in the middle of the aisle, but I couldn't believe it. He was there just a second ago, I was sure of it. Panic set in. I started walking through the train, checking every car. Each one was empty, no sign of him. I even checked the bathroom, but there was no one. Maybe I'd just imagined him. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, a smudge on the seat where he'd been sitting. A small dark stain. Blood. I leaned closer, heart racing. There was a faint trail, barely noticeable, leading to the door he'd disappeared through. My stomach twisted. What had I gotten myself into? I went to the conductor's cabin, but it was locked. I pounded on the door, shouting, but no one answered. My phone had no signal, and there was no one else on the train. I was alone, completely alone. Or was I? I felt the walls closing in. What if he was still on the train, hiding somewhere? What if he was watching me? And then I saw it, his beanie, lying on the floor of the last car. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. The fabric was rough, and I could feel the dampness from sweat or something else. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it. I was shaking, clutching it like some kind of proof that he was real, that he'd been there. Suddenly, the train jerked to a stop. The lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, but everything looked warped, wrong. I started to hear footsteps, soft, slow, echoing down the car. I turned, swinging the light around, and saw him. The man, standing completely still at the far end of the car, staring right at me. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. My chest tightened. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. He took a step forward. I ran. My feet were slipping, stumbling as I raced to the other end of the car. The door was locked, the emergency intercom shattered. I pounded on the glass, desperate. When I turned back, he was gone. Just gone. I collapsed, gasping for air. Then I remembered something I'd seen earlier, a news report about a man who had escaped from a psychiatric facility nearby, a man with a history of violent behavior. The description matched the man I'd seen on the train. My blood turned to ice. The train started moving again, and I slowly made my way to the front. The next station loomed, deserted. The conductor, a middle-aged man, looked at me with confusion as I stumbled out. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked. I tried to explain, but he just stared. He checked the train. No man, no blood, nothing. "You must be tired," he said gently. "Imagining things." I felt a wave of frustration and confusion, but then he said something that made my skin crawl. "You know, you're not the first person to report seeing someone like that on a late-night train. There's an old story. Just an urban legend, really." He chuckled, shaking his head, but I couldn't laugh. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Weeks have passed. I've been avoiding the train, taking taxis, but I keep seeing him. In reflections, in passing cars. My therapist says it's just my mind processing trauma, but I can't shake it. Last night, I got a text from an unknown number. "You saw me. Don't forget." I froze. The number was untraceable. Real or not, I'll never know. I deleted the message and locked my phone, but in the dark screen's reflection, I thought I saw him standing behind me just for a split second. The wrong delivery. I didn't think I'd be posting on Reddit for something like this, but I just need to get it out. Maybe someone has gone through something similar and can offer advice. It all started a few weeks ago, and I haven't been the same since. For context, I live alone in a quiet neighborhood. I'm a creature of habit. I like routines, and I avoid unnecessary social interactions. I work from home, spend my evenings reading or watching TV, and hardly ever leave except to grab groceries or take a walk in the nearby park. Everything was predictable, safe. Then, little things started happening. Nothing too alarming at first. Like, I'd come into my office and notice my chair slightly turned even though I always leave it facing the desk. Or I'd get calls from unknown numbers that would hang up after a single ring. I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness and brushed it off. The real trouble began when I got a delivery notice. I didn't think much of it. I hadn't ordered anything recently, but I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor's package got sent to me by accident. But when I checked my doorstep, there it was, a plain, unmarked box with no return address or sender information. I decided to bring it inside, just in case it was something I forgot about. Opening it felt wrong somehow, but I did it anyway. Inside were a pair of shoes, my exact size, a t-shirt in my favorite color, and a small notebook. I felt a strange unease as I flipped through it. The pages were filled with dates and locations, places I go to regularly. My usual coffee shop, the bench in the park, even the corner store where I buy snacks. Then I found the photo. It was a picture of me, taken from a distance, as I sat at my favorite spot in the park. My blood ran cold. At the bottom of the box was a note, "See you soon." I called the delivery company, heart pounding, but they had no record of any package delivered to my address. Maybe someone just left it on your porch, the rep said dismissively. We don't have anything under that tracking number. I could tell they thought I was making it up. I hung up, the unease turning into a gnawing dread. The next morning, I decided to throw the whole thing away. It was probably just some sick joke. I tossed the box and its contents into the trash bin outside and tried to move on. But when I came back home that evening, the box was on my doorstep again. My hand shook as I picked it up and brought it inside. This time, there was something new inside. A set of keys, a flash drive, and an audio recording of me talking on the phone with my mom the previous night. The panic set in. How did they get a recording of my conversation? Who had been close enough to take it? I changed the locks immediately, installed cameras all around my house, and kept my phone in my pocket at all times. I called the police, but without any clear evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. Probably just a prank, they said, brushing me off. Days passed and I started noticing a car parked outside my house every night. A black sedan, its windows tinted. I'd catch glimpses of it from my window, but whenever I'd go outside, it would pull away slowly. It felt like a game, and I was the prey. Every little sound made me jump. Every creak of the house felt like a footstep. I knew I was being watched, but I couldn't prove it. One night, I received an email from an unknown sender. It was a video of me sitting at my desk, staring at my computer just as I was doing now. The timestamp showed it was live. My heart nearly stopped when I read the accompanying message. Don't worry, you're not alone. I felt trapped, desperate. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was going to happen next. So I set up a plan. I pretended to leave for work the next morning, locking the door behind me. But I didn't leave. I stayed inside, crouched in the closet with a baseball bat in one hand and my phone in the other, set to dial emergency services. Hours passed. My muscles ached from the tension. And then I heard it. A faint creak of the floorboards, a soft shuffling sound coming from my bedroom. Someone was inside. I held my breath, straining to hear. More footsteps. My pulse pounded in my ears. Slowly, I eased the closet door open and crept toward the bedroom, empty. But the front door was ajar. They were toying with me. I rushed to the living room, and that's when I saw it. Another note on the coffee table. Next time, I'll say hi. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I spun around, realizing the cameras I'd installed were off. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, but as I did, my eyes fell on something that turned my fear into full-blown terror. A single pair of my socks, missing from the laundry basket. They'd been in my house, close enough to take something small, something personal, and I'd had no idea. The police came, searched every inch of the place, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. It's best if you stay somewhere else, they suggested, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was my home. I installed more security measures, new cameras, window locks, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. That night, as I settled into bed, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, I noticed something chilling. The faint, familiar scent of my shampoo on the pillow next to mine. Now, I'm a wreck. I barely sleep. Every noise, every shadow feels like a threat. I posted this, hoping someone could offer advice, or maybe just listen. I've thought about moving, but I doubt it'll help. They've gotten too close. They know too much. Just as I finished typing this, I got a direct message. I enjoyed the story. Let's write the next chapter together. The hiker. I haven't been hiking since that day. I used to go every other weekend with a small group of friends, Jamie, Alex, and Max. It was our thing. We'd explore remote trails, places far from the city, where it felt like we were the only ones alive. But after what happened a year ago, I can't even look at a hiking trail without my chest tightening up. It was supposed to be just another hike. We had chosen a trail deep in the woods, far away from any towns or roads. A perfect spot, Alex had said. He'd found it on some obscure hiking forum. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no other cars at the trailhead, no sounds of birds or wind, just silence. But we brushed it off. It was early in the morning, after all. About half an hour into the hike, I felt something odd, like we were being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia and kept up with the others. I even joked about it when I saw a shadowy figure in the distance. Must be a deer, I laughed, shaking it off as if I believed it. After a couple of hours, we decided to take a break. That's when Alex wandered off, saying he'd be back in a minute. 15 minutes passed, then 20. We started calling out for him, but there was no response. At first, we thought he was pranking us. Alex loved playing jokes, always trying to scare us on these hikes. But when he didn't answer our shouts or calls, a knot of anxiety started forming in my stomach. Maybe he got lost, Max suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Jamie agreed, but we were all worried. The woods around us were dense, and without a clear path, it would be easy to lose your way. We fanned out, each of us taking a different direction to search. As we walked further, calling his name over and over, the silence felt suffocating. Hours passed. No Alex. No signs of him at all. Just as we were about to give up and head back to the car to get help, we heard it. A scream. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and desperate. It sounded like Alex, but it cut off so suddenly that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. "What the hell was that?" Jamie whispered, his eyes wide with fear. None of us moved. We were too stunned, too afraid to think straight. Finally, I took a deep breath and suggested we go find the source of the scream. We were already deep in the woods, and the last thing we wanted was to leave Alex out here alone. We paired off, me and Jamie, Max on his own, and agreed to meet back in 20 minutes. As Jamie and I moved further in, the woods seemed to close in around us. Shadows flickered in the corner of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Jamie muttered that he thought we were being followed, but I waved it off, trying to keep my cool. And then, we both heard it. Footsteps. Fast, running footsteps coming up behind us. We spun around, flashlights sweeping through the trees, but nothing. Just empty forest. My pulse raced as we decided to head back to the meeting spot. When we got there, only Max was waiting. "I heard his voice," Max said, his voice shaking. "He was calling for help. It was coming from that direction." We followed Max to where he'd heard Alex's voice, only to stumble upon a gruesome sight. Alex's jacket was hanging from a tree, torn and stained with blood. I felt sick. As I turned to say something, there was a heavy thud behind us. We froze. The sound was unmistakable. Something heavy had hit the ground. Slowly, we turned toward the noise and saw it. Alex's body hanging from a tree. His face was pale, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. We stood there, paralyzed by shock and horror. "Cut him down!" Jamie shouted. But as we moved closer, the sound of movement surrounded us. Leaves rustled. Footsteps circled us, staying just outside the range of our flashlights. My hand shook as I fumbled for my knife. "Leave him," I finally whispered. "We need to go." But as soon as we turned to run, we saw a figure. Just beyond the reach of our lights, a shadowy silhouette stood motionless, blocking our path. Panic surged, and we bolted in the opposite direction. I could barely think straight. I just ran, not knowing where I was going, blindly crashing through the trees. I don't know how long we ran, but when we finally stopped, we realized we were completely lost. The forest seemed different, alien. As we argued over which way to go, Max's flashlight flickered, then went out. Jamie's light followed a second later, plunging us into darkness. That's when we heard it, a low, mocking whistle echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. And then, the sound of footsteps again, slowly getting closer. We ran. Jamie tripped, falling hard. He cried out, clutching his ankle. I hesitated, torn between helping him and running for my life. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with fear and resignation. Go, he whispered. Just go. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran, leaving him behind. I heard the footsteps approaching Jamie, then his scream, a sound I'll never forget. I burst out of the woods just as the sky was starting to lighten. I collapsed near the trailhead, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking. A rescue team found me an hour later. They'd been alerted when we hadn't checked in. I tried to explain, but all I could say was, "Someone's out there." They never found Jamie's body. The authorities said Alex's death was a tragic accident, a misstep that led to him hanging himself in a desperate attempt to survive. They called Jamie's disappearance a case of someone getting lost and succumbing to the elements. But I know the truth. A few days ago, I checked the forum where Alex had found the trail. There was a new post, a picture of Alex and Jamie on that same trail. It was blurry, but it was them. The caption read, "Next time, don't come alone." The Babysitter's Nightmare. I've been holding on to this story for a while, and I think it's finally time to share it. I used to work as a part-time babysitter for a family in a quiet suburb, looking after their two kids, age 7 and 4. I took the job to earn some extra cash while studying, and for the first few months, everything was perfectly normal. The parents, Rebecca and Mark, were nice, the kids were great, and the house itself was spacious and welcoming. But there was one thing about the house that always felt off to me: the attic. It was locked tight, and whenever I asked about it, Mark would just chuckle and say it was full of forgotten memories. He'd brush off any further questions, and I never pressed. Still, small things started happening that put me on edge. I'd find toys in strange places, even though I knew I'd put them away. Keys that I'd left on the counter would end up on the floor. And one time, I came back to the living room to find the back door wide open. I told myself it was just me being careless, or maybe the kids were playing tricks. But one night, after the kids were asleep, I heard faint creaking noises coming from the ceiling above me. I brushed it off as the house settling, but the thought that someone, or something, was up there lingered in my mind. A few weeks later, I arrived for my usual babysitting shift and noticed something strange. The attic door, which was always locked, was slightly open. I froze for a moment, feeling my heart rate spike, but I decided not to check inside. I closed it gently, trying to shake off the unease, and mentioned it to the parents when they got home. Rebecca laughed and said, "It's an old house. Things like that happen." Mark agreed, mentioning they'd had trouble with the door latch before. They didn't seem concerned, so I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The next time I came over, I put the kids to bed and settled downstairs to watch TV, but as I sat there, I heard it again. The creaking sound, but louder this time, as if someone was deliberately walking upstairs. My first thought was that one of the kids had woken up, so I went up to check. But both kids were sound asleep in their beds. That's when I noticed the attic door again. It was open, just a crack, but enough for a cold draft to seep through. I stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself to close it and forget about it. As I took a step closer, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping from within the attic. Fear flooded me, and I backed away, unable to decide whether I should call the parents or the police. The next morning, I brought up the attic door again, telling Rebecca that I'd heard noises. She shrugged it off, saying they'd had issues with raccoons getting in before and that it was nothing to worry about. Her casual dismissal made me feel like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following week, I was extra vigilant. I kept an eye on every little detail. I noticed more toys appearing in places they shouldn't be, and lights I knew I'd turned off were back on. One night, I heard what sounded like whispering, but when I looked around, no one was there. I started carrying a small kitchen knife in my bag for protection, just in case. I even considered quitting, but I didn't want to leave the kids. During one shift, as I was tucking them in, the 7-year-old looked at me and said, "Mommy told me not to go in the attic 'cause that's where Mr. Quiet lives." My heart skipped a beat. "Who's Mr. Quiet?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "He's the man who walks funny," she replied with a shrug, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That night, as I sat in the living room, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving directly above me in the attic. I froze, clutching the knife hidden in my bag. The steps continued, pacing back and forth, until they suddenly stopped, right above where I was sitting. The air went silent. I dialed Rebecca's number with trembling fingers and whispered what was happening. They were on their way home, and Rebecca told me to leave the house immediately. But I was too scared to move. What if whoever was up there came down if I tried to leave? Minutes dragged by like hours, and then I heard it, the creak of the attic door opening. My heart pounded as soft, shuffling footsteps began descending the stairs. I hid behind the kitchen counter, holding my breath as the footsteps grew closer. The steps stopped near the bottom of the stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't come any closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the front door burst open. Mark stormed in holding a baseball bat. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the sound of my heartbeat, and the footsteps scrambled back up the stairs. The police arrived shortly after. They searched the attic and the entire house but found no one. The only sign that anyone had been there was an empty juice bottle, an old blanket, and a stack of food wrappers hidden behind a pile of boxes. The police told Mark and Rebecca it was probably a homeless person who had somehow gotten in and used the attic as a hiding place. But I know what I heard. Those footsteps were deliberate and far too confident for someone just looking for a place to sleep. I quit babysitting for the family the next week. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that attic door creaking open. I avoided their calls and focused on school, trying to forget everything that happened. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual friend that the family had moved out of the house. Rebecca mentioned feeling uneasy and wanting a fresh start elsewhere. I felt a sense of relief until I learned that the new owners found a hidden trapdoor in the attic, leading to a narrow crawl space. Inside, they found old clothing, a mattress, and several notebooks filled with childlike scribbles. I still have nightmares about the attic door slowly creaking open, of those footsteps inching closer and closer to my hiding spot. Maybe it's all in my head, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was up there was never planning to leave. The silent alarm. I'm a 32-year-old bachelor living alone in a quiet neighborhood. For the most part, my life is pretty ordinary. I've got a 9-to-5 job in IT, spend weekends with friends, and enjoy my solitude. A couple of months ago, I decided to install a home security system. There'd been a string of break-ins around my area, and though I hadn't experienced anything myself, it made me uncomfortable. I liked the idea of being able to monitor my home remotely and get alerts if anything happened. The system was straightforward: cameras inside and outside, motion detectors, and an app that kept me connected to it all. It made me feel secure at first, as if I'd taken control of my safety. But I didn't realize it would have the opposite effect. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd occasionally get a notification about my cat triggering the living room camera or a delivery person at the front door. But there were these small, unsettling moments, tiny things that didn't seem worth mentioning at the time. Once, I noticed a window I'd swear I'd locked was slightly ajar. Another time, I found a single shoe of mine in the hallway instead of in the closet where I always keep them. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness. One afternoon, everything changed. I was at work when I got a notification on my phone. Motion detected, living room. My heart started racing. I opened the app expecting to see my cat wandering around, but there was nothing, just an empty room. I rushed home, expecting the worst. I checked every room, opened every closet, and even looked under the bed. Nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. Maybe it was a glitch in the system, I thought. But later that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I reset the system, hoping it was just a one-time error. The next day, it happened again. This time, the alert was for the kitchen. I left work early, speeding all the way home. Again, nothing. Everything was exactly as I left it. But I noticed something odd. A kitchen chair was pulled out slightly, just an inch or two. Had I left it like that? As the days went on, I received more notifications. Sometimes they were in the living room, sometimes the hallway, sometimes the bedroom. Each time I got one, I'd rush home, feeling more frantic and desperate. I called the security company to check if the system was malfunctioning, but they found no issues. I started losing sleep, obsessing over every detail. I moved furniture, set up new cameras, and installed more sensors, but the alerts kept coming. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was in my house knew my schedule. The motion alerts would only happen when I wasn't home. It got to the point where I started setting traps, placing tape on door frames to see if they'd been opened, leaving flour on the floor to catch footprints. One evening, I came home to find the tape disturbed. I knew then I wasn't imagining things. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That my security system kept sending me alerts? That I thought someone was entering my house but couldn't find any proof? I imagined the officer's face, his disbelief. I felt alone, like I was trapped in my own mind. I became obsessed with catching whoever it was. I set up an old phone to stream live footage to my work computer, watching the feed obsessively. Then it happened. I saw it. A shadow passing through the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see any features, just a dark shape gliding by. I grabbed my keys and drove home faster than I ever had. When I burst through the front door, everything was still. The house was silent, almost mocking me with its normalcy. I searched everywhere, but as usual, nothing was out of place. That's when I saw it. A small note stuck in my mailbox. It read, "Saw you watching. Nice setup." My blood ran cold. Someone was in my house. I knew it now. They weren't just getting in. They were playing with me. Desperate to end it, I decided to stay home one day, pretending to leave but hiding in a corner of my bedroom. Hours passed. Then, my phone buzzed. Motion detected, hallway. I felt a surge of panic. How could there be motion if I was right there? I crept to the door, my heart pounding. There was no sound, no movement. Then I heard it, a faint click from the front door. Holding my breath, I moved slowly toward the hallway. Through the crack of the door, I saw the knob turn slowly, almost deliberately. I froze, terror holding me in place. The door opened just an inch, then closed softly. Silence followed. I waited, counting the seconds. Finally, I summoned the courage to check. I flung the door open and saw nothing. No one was there. I looked down at the security panel. A red light was flashing. It said the front door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it before I hid. My hands trembled as I relocked it and stumbled to the living room. I collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the empty room. Someone had been inside. Or were they still here? My phone buzzed again. Motion detected, living room. I looked around, confusion giving way to horror. I was in the living room. My phone showed movement right where I was standing. My stomach dropped. With shaking hands, I deleted the security app. I couldn't handle it anymore. I decided to leave for good. I packed a few things and stepped outside, locking the door behind me. As I looked back at the house, it felt like it was watching me. I drove away, feeling a mix of relief and despair. What if they were never inside? What if they were watching from outside the whole time? I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw a flash of movement, just for a second, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I kept driving, not looking back again. I still wonder if they're watching me. The jogger's route. I used to be an evening jogger. The park near my place was perfect, well lit, with a clear track and always full of people, families, dog walkers, and other joggers like me. I had my usual route, starting at the north entrance, circling the pond, and then looping back to my apartment. It was my time to unwind after a long day, and for a while, it felt safe. But then I started noticing him. Just a man standing at the same spot by the park's exit every single day. He never looked out of place, just a regular guy, standing by the path with his hands in his pockets. At first I thought nothing of it, but after a few days it became impossible to ignore. He was always there, always at the exact same time I finished my run. One day, I made the mistake of looking directly at him. I expected him to look away or pretend he hadn't been staring, but he didn't. He looked right back, straight into my eyes, and it felt like a punch to the gut. I shrugged it off as paranoia, but from that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just there by coincidence. I decided to switch things up, jogging in the mornings before work. I thought it'd be enough to avoid him, but when I rounded the final corner of my route, there he was, standing at the park's entrance. The next day, I tried midday. He was there again, casually leaning against a tree as if he'd been waiting. My mind spun with possibilities. Maybe he was just another jogger, or maybe he lived nearby. But if that was the case, why didn't I ever see him running or leaving? He just watched. To test it further, I changed my route completely, opting for a secluded path that curved deeper into the park, away from the crowds. I thought I'd finally lose him, but halfway through the run, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing near the entry to the secluded area. How did he know I'd be there? My heart raced, and I picked up speed, running until I was back in the safety of my apartment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moments in my head, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the fear lingered. A few days later, I tried jogging again, determined not to let him control me. I noticed a white van parked along my new route. It hadn't been there before. I glanced inside, and that's when I saw him, talking to the driver. They both turned to look at me, and my blood ran cold. I didn't stop to think. I just ran, faster than I ever had. I stayed away from the park after that, avoiding jogging altogether. For a few days, I thought I'd be okay. Then, one evening, I spotted the same van parked a few houses down from mine. It was unmistakable. I knew it was them. Panic set in. I told a friend, but she brushed it off as a misunderstanding. Maybe it's just a coincidence, she suggested. I even considered going to the police, but what could I say? There's a guy who shows up at the park when I jog. It sounded ridiculous, and without any real threat, I doubted they'd take me seriously. That evening, I took a deep breath and decided I had to confront him. I drove to the park, determined to get answers. I spotted him almost immediately. I got out of my car and started walking towards him, but before I could say anything, he turned, got into the van, and sped off. I managed to note down the license plate, and checked it online later that night. Stolen. The van had been reported missing weeks ago. My heart sank. This wasn't a misunderstanding. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a man's voice whispered, "I like your new route." Then the line went dead. He knew. He was watching me, not just when I jogged, but all the time. Terrified, I stopped going out altogether, avoiding my usual routines. I stayed inside, checking the locks obsessively, peeking out the windows every few minutes. I barely ate, barely slept. One evening, a friend came over, trying to convince me I was safe. We were chatting in the living room when, suddenly, the lights went out. I told myself it was just a power cut, but when I looked outside, every other house on the street still had power. I grabbed my friend's hand and we hid in the bedroom. We heard footsteps outside, soft, deliberate steps on the gravel near the back door. Then, a scraping sound, like metal against wood. I called the police, whispering into the phone, my voice shaking. The police arrived within minutes. They found signs of forced entry at the back door, but no one around. "Probably just an attempted break-in," one of the officers said dismissively. "Happens all the time." I nodded, too numb to argue, but I knew it wasn't just a random break-in. As the officers left, I noticed a note stuck to the front door, a single line scribbled in black ink. "See you around." No name, no signature, just a threat that felt far too real. I decided to stay with a friend after that. I couldn't be alone. I talked about moving away, even changing jobs, just to get away from this nightmare. It felt like I was reclaiming a small piece of control. But before I left her place, my phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I didn't answer. The voicemail left behind was just silence. And then, faint breathing. I moved in with my parents in a different city, thinking I'd finally be safe. But one afternoon, as I looked out the window, I saw it. A white van parked across the street. I blinked, and it drove away. I couldn't tell if it was him or if my mind was playing tricks. I don't know what to do anymore. I thought sharing my story would help, but now I'm not sure if I've only made things worse. What would you do if you knew someone was watching you, but you could never prove it? Because I'm starting to think he's never really going to leave me alone. The hidden room, the worst decision of my life. I've never shared this before. Honestly, I still don't know if I'm ready, but I need to get it out. Maybe then I'll be able to sleep through the night. Last year, I inherited an old house from a distant relative I barely knew. It was in a small town far from the city, completely isolated and run down, but it had potential. I thought it would be a good opportunity to start fresh. I'm not exactly the handyman type, but I was determined to turn it into my dream home. I noticed some odd things right from the start. Tools would go missing, only to turn up somewhere else. Doors creaked open on their own, and the basement always had this smell, like something rotting deep within the walls. I told myself it was just an old house settling, nothing to be concerned about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That changed when I found the photograph. I was working in the basement one day when I noticed a small crack in the wall. Curious, I started chipping away at it. That's when I found it, an old torn photograph wedged inside. It showed a corner of a room I didn't recognize. There was nothing significant about it, but something about the image unsettled me. I should have left it alone. I should have stopped. Instead, I kept going, breaking down the wall entirely. That's when I discovered the hidden room. It was small and cramped, with no windows. The air inside was thick and musty. A few pieces of furniture, an old chair, a small table, sat in the center, covered in sheets. As I stepped inside, I noticed restraints bolted into the walls and floor. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked closer and found faded drawings, crude depictions of people tied up, screaming, and crying. My heart pounded as I realized what this place might have been used for. And then I found the photos, a bundle of them, crammed into a drawer. Grainy black and white images of people, different people, bound and gagged in this very room. They all looked terrified, their eyes pleading. I felt sick. Who were these people? What happened to them? That's when I saw it. A photograph that looked newer than the others. It was a picture of me, standing outside the house, taken from somewhere in the woods. I dropped it, my hands trembling. I left the room as fast as I could and locked the basement door. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the restraints, the drawings, and those desperate faces. The next day, I tried contacting the real estate agent. I wanted answers. But when I called, he was vague, almost like he didn't want to talk about it. The house's history is complicated, he said, his voice tight. Just don't spend too much time down there. Frustrated, I tried looking up the previous owners. There was no record of them. No names, no transactions, nothing. It was like they didn't exist. My anxiety grew. I was living in a house with a hidden torture room, and I couldn't find any information about who owned it or what had happened there. Desperate, I called the police. I needed someone to see it, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. 2 officers came by, but by the time they arrived, the hidden room was empty. The restraints, the drawings, the photos, everything was gone. They looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe it's best you get some rest, one of them suggested gently before they left. That night, I started feeling like I was being watched. I'd hear faint footsteps outside my bedroom window, soft scraping noises against the walls, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. I was on edge, jumping at every sound. Then I found the camera. I was changing a light bulb in the bedroom when I noticed a small, dark object hidden inside the vent. I pulled it out, my heart racing. It was a camera, tiny, well hidden, and pointed directly at my bed. Someone had been watching me. My skin crawled as I realized that whoever had been using that room hadn't gone far. They were still around, monitoring my every move. That's when I received the message. You shouldn't have found the room. We know where you are. I packed a bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. I needed to get out. As I was heading for the door, I heard footsteps downstairs. I froze, listening. Voices followed, muffled but close. I crept down the stairs and peeked around the corner. There were people moving through my house, 3 or 4 of them, carrying bags and talking in hushed tones. One of them turned, and I recognized him immediately. It was the real estate agent. My blood ran cold. What the hell was he doing here? They were emptying the basement, carrying things out the back door. I realized then that they were part of whatever had happened in that room. They weren't just here to hide evidence. They were here to silence me. I ran for the back door, but one of them spotted me. "Hey!" he shouted, and they all turned, rushing after me. I bolted through the house and into the woods, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. A figure loomed over me, holding a flashlight. It was a woman, calm, almost kind-looking. She smiled down at me. "We just want the house back," she said softly. I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying in my bed, my head pounding. My bag was gone. The house was silent, the basement door sealed shut. I grabbed my phone and opened Reddit. My post ended here. The comments exploded with speculation. Some users thought I was making it up. Others said they'd heard similar stories in this area. But one comment stood out. "Don't buy it. They're still there." The house went back on the market a week later. I don't know who bought it, but if you're reading this, please don't make the same mistake I did. The public restroom encounter. I never thought I'd be one of those people sharing their story here, but something happened to me a few months ago that I can't stop thinking about. I'm a 27-year-old woman, and my job often requires me to drive long distances alone. I've always been cautious. I check my car before leaving, stick to main roads, and keep my phone fully charged. But one night, everything went wrong. It started with a detour. There was unexpected road work on the highway, and I had no choice but to take an unfamiliar route. I ended up on a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but darkness. My gut told me to keep driving, but I ignored it, thinking I was just being paranoid. As I drove, I noticed a strange tapping noise coming from the back of the car. I figured it was just something loose in the trunk, but it made me uneasy. When I saw the rest stop sign ahead, I felt a wave of relief. The lot was empty, and the small restroom building looked run down, but I convinced myself it was just a quick stop. I needed to stretch my legs and use the bathroom. It's funny how you can talk yourself into ignoring every instinct telling you to keep driving. I parked and got out. The air was cool and quiet. Too quiet. As I walked towards the restroom, the silence was interrupted by the flickering of the fluorescent lights. They buzzed erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. There were two stalls inside. One door was slightly open, the other shut tight. I chose the open one. I wanted to see inside, make sure I was alone. As I used the bathroom, I thought I heard faint footsteps outside. I told myself it was nothing. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time, and I felt my chest tighten. I quickly finished and stepped out to wash my hands. That's when I saw it. The door to the closed stall had shifted slightly. Through the tiny crack, I caught a glimpse of an eye staring directly at me. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a trick of the light? But I couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched. I forced myself to keep washing my hands, pretending I hadn't noticed. The door creaked open a little more, and I saw a hand gripping the side of the door. He hadn't moved. He was still standing inside, watching me with a twisted smile. I knew I had to get out, but I didn't want to run. Running might make him react. I dried my hands slowly, trying to appear calm. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I turned towards the exit. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it, it swung open slightly on its own, pushed by the wind. I glanced back, and the man stepped out of the stall. He was tall and disheveled, with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He just stood there, staring at me with that same smile, as if he was daring me to make a move. I tried to speak, but all I managed was a strained, "Hi." He didn't respond. I could feel my heart racing, each beat echoing in my ears. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I felt paralyzed. What if he had a weapon? What if he was waiting for me to turn my back? Then, in a split-second decision, I lunged forward and shoved the door open with all my strength. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched as I stumbled out and ran to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming the locks down. I glanced back at the restroom building. The man was standing in the doorway, still smiling. He raised his hand and waved, a slow, casual motion that sent chills down my spine. It was like he knew something I didn't. I didn't waste another second. I started the car and sped out of the lot, gravel crunching under the tires as I tore down the empty road. My hands were trembling, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be chasing me on foot. But he wasn't. Instead, I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. A dark sedan pulled out of a hidden spot and started following me. That's when I realized he wasn't alone. I floored the accelerator, pushing my car faster than I'd ever driven before. My phone had no signal, and I was terrified I'd lose control and crash. The dark sedan kept its distance, never getting too close, but it was always there, trailing me like a predator watching its prey. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the glowing lights of a truck stop ahead. I veered sharply into the lot, tires screeching, and parked near a row of trucks. The sedan slowed down at the entrance, lingering for a moment before turning around and driving off. I watched it disappear into the night, but I knew I wasn't safe. Shaking, I stumbled out of the car and ran into the truck stop. As I entered, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. With a sinking feeling, I pulled it out. It was a small note with just 2 words: "Nice try." I almost collapsed right there. Inside, I explained everything to the clerk, who called the police. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. One of the truckers mentioned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Several women had gone missing from rest stops along this highway in the past year. Weeks later, I heard on the news that a body had been found at the same rest stop. The description of the suspect matched the man I saw that night. I haven't driven that route since. I still get nightmares, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't decided to run. If you're ever alone on the road at night, trust your instincts. I didn't, and I'm lucky to be alive. The hotel room. I've traveled a lot for work over the past few years, so I'm used to staying in hotels. They all sort of blend together after a while. The same beige walls, the same musty smell of old carpet, the same 2 soft beds. This last trip, though, was different. It wasn't just another business trip. Something about it made my skin crawl, and I still can't shake off the feeling. I checked into a hotel for a 3-day conference. It was the usual corporate gig: long presentations, networking, and lots of coffee. I felt relieved when I finally got to my room. I was looking forward to having a bit of quiet time. As soon as I walked in, I noticed something strange. The window was left slightly open. For a hotel in a city known for its cold weather, that seemed odd. The room felt a bit chilly, but I just assumed the last guest wanted fresh air or something. I closed the window, shrugged it off, and moved on. The first day of the conference went by uneventfully. When I returned to my room that evening, though, things felt different. The TV was on. I was sure I turned it off before leaving. The remote was placed neatly on the pillow, which I never do. I froze for a moment, feeling a strange unease creep up my spine. Then I brushed it off, figuring maybe I hit the remote by accident when I left. But when I went to unpack, I noticed my suitcase was slightly open too. I didn't leave it that way. I checked the lock on the door, which seemed fine. I called the front desk, trying not to sound crazy, and asked if anyone had been in my room. They told me no one had entered since I checked in. I wanted to believe them, but something still felt off. As I hung up, I glanced at the bathroom. My toiletries were shifted around slightly. Nothing missing, just moved, like someone had been touching them. It was unsettling, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I decided to take some precautions. I placed tiny pieces of tape on the door frame, right where the door would break them if opened. I also balanced a coin on the edge of the desk, a place where it would easily fall if someone brushed past. If someone was getting into my room, I'd know for sure. I left for the conference feeling foolish but desperate for some peace of mind. When I returned that evening, I saw it immediately. The tape on the door was broken. The coin on the desk had moved. My heart started pounding. I knew it. Someone was coming in here. I called the front desk again, but they maintained their stance. No one entered my room. Furious and scared, I demanded to see the security footage. They hesitated, but finally agreed. Sitting with the hotel manager, I watched the footage closely. It showed nothing unusual, just staff cleaning rooms down the hall. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing by my door for just a second before disappearing out of frame. I couldn't see their face. but it was enough to send my paranoia into overdrive. Someone was watching me. That night, I decided I was going to catch them. I hid in the closet, leaving the door slightly open so I could see the room. I sat there for hours, clutching my phone, trying to stay as still as possible. I felt ridiculous, but I was determined to confront whoever was messing with me. Just as I was about to give up, I heard the soft click of the door unlocking. My heart stopped. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside. I could barely breathe. They moved quietly, glancing around as if checking if the room was empty. I couldn't see much, just the back of their head as they walked further in. Without thinking, I burst out of the closet, shouting. The figure jumped, dropping what looked like cleaning supplies. The lights flicked on, and I saw her clearly, a woman in a hotel uniform, eyes wide with terror. "What the hell are you doing in my room?" I yelled, still holding my phone up like a weapon. She stammered, shaking. I'm just the cleaner. It's part of my job to check rooms at night." "What?" I couldn't believe it. All this time, it was just a cleaner? She looked at me, clearly scared. "We had a guest leave a window open a few months ago. It caused water damage, so now we check empty rooms to make sure everything's secure." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I'd been hiding in a closet, ready to attack a cleaner. I apologized profusely, but she just nodded, looking like she wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. After she left, I sat on the bed, heart still racing. My paranoia had blown things way out of proportion. The manager came to my room after I called. We had a long conversation. He explained the hotel's policies, and I could tell he was trying hard to be patient with me. I felt like an idiot. I apologized again, and he accepted, though I could tell he wasn't too happy about the situation. I'd scared one of their staff members, and it was all because I let my fear get the best of me. The next morning, I was packing up, ready to leave. I still couldn't shake off that weird feeling, though. As I zipped up my suitcase, I noticed it again. Something off. I could have sworn I zipped it differently before. I shook my head, trying to push away the thoughts. It was just paranoia, I told myself. Nothing more. I checked out, still feeling embarrassed. I passed by the cleaning staff member in the hallway, but she didn't look at me. I don't blame her. I was about to leave when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. It was an unknown number. "You should be more careful with where you hide." I felt a chill run down my spine. Was it just a joke? A coincidence? I didn't know. I left the hotel as quickly as I could. I've tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I can't shake that last message. Even now, I'm not sure if I was being paranoid, or if there really was something to fear in that hotel room. The Lost Hiker's Guide. I've always been an avid hiker. Whenever life gets overwhelming, I escape to the woods. There's something about being surrounded by nature that helps me clear my mind. This particular day, I decided to visit a dense forest I'd hiked before, but never fully explored. I needed the solitude. Work had been a mess, and I'd recently gone through a tough breakup. A solo hike felt like the perfect way to get some clarity. As I parked my car, there was only one other vehicle there, an old truck with muddy tires. A man stood by it, loading gear into his backpack. We exchanged brief nods. He smiled, but it lingered a bit too long, his eyes following me as I adjusted my gear. I brushed off the unease. It was probably nothing, just another hiker. I stepped onto the trail and immediately noticed a single ribbon tied around a tree branch. It was bright red, standing out against the green leaves. I shrugged, assuming it was left by a previous hiker, maybe as a marker. I had no idea then how wrong I was. About 2 miles in, I saw another ribbon, this time blue. Odd, but not alarming. As I continued, I found a third, yellow one, tied in a peculiar knot. The deeper I went, the more I realized I didn't quite recognize this part of the forest. I checked my GPS, and sure enough, I wasn't too far off from my planned route. But I felt an inexplicable pull to follow the ribbons. I convinced myself it was just curiosity. I reasoned that if they led nowhere, I'd turn back. The path marked by the ribbons started to curve subtly away from the main trail. The forest around me grew denser, and the light shifted strangely through the trees. The air felt heavy and still. Suddenly, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the silent woods. I tried to laugh off the panic building in my chest, but the unease stayed with me. I continued, my steps slower, more deliberate. The ribbons became more frequent, almost as if they were urging me forward. After another half mile, I decided to stop for a break and catch my breath. When I looked around, something was terribly wrong. The ribbons, every single one I'd been following, were gone. I couldn't see a single one in any direction. Panic clawed at my throat. I took out my phone, but there was no signal. My compass spun wildly, and the sun seemed to be setting faster than it should have. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trees all looked the same. I called out, my voice sounding small and desperate in the silence. Nothing. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness. I started walking faster, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a fourth ribbon. This one was different, frayed and dirty, as if it had been here for years. My hand shook as I reached out to touch it, and that's when I heard it. A voice, faint and far away, calling my name. My heart hammered in my chest. I spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound. It was too familiar, like someone I should recognize but couldn't quite place. I shouted, but only my name echoed back to me through the trees. I started to run, panic driving me deeper into the forest. My footsteps were erratic. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. The ribbons reappeared intermittently, almost taunting me, as if whoever put them there knew exactly where I'd go. I spotted new markings, slashes on tree trunks and crude arrows pointing in conflicting directions. It was as if someone was trying to confuse me, keep me lost. I broke into a small clearing and froze. In the center was a makeshift campsite, long abandoned. A rusted camping stove and a torn tent lay scattered, like the remnants of a place someone left in a hurry. I noticed a child's shoe half buried in the dirt, an old, faded map pinned under a rock, and more ribbons, neatly coiled and waiting to be used. I stepped forward and stumbled over a journal, its cover weathered and pages yellowed. I picked it up and flipped through it, my fingers trembling. The entries described a hiker who followed ribbons, just like I had, and kept hearing their own name called out. The last entry ended abruptly, the final word smeared with something dark. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound. And then I heard it again, the voice, closer now, calling my name. I dropped the journal and ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not caring about direction. Branches whipped at my face, underbrush tangled around my legs, but I didn't stop. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, every nerve screaming at me to keep going and never look back. After what felt like hours, I stumbled back onto a familiar trail. Relief and fear warred within me. I'd made it out, at least I thought I had. But a small, nagging doubt crept in. Had I escaped, or was I allowed to leave? I paused, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the voice one last time, softer now, almost a whisper carried by the wind. Come back. Back home, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, the stress of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Maybe the voice was just the wind and the ribbons. Maybe they were from an old hiking group. But none of those explanations brought me comfort. I looked up the forest online, finding a small article about missing hikers in that area. One detail stood out. Every disappearance had reports of strange ribbons tied to trees. I deleted my search history and shut my laptop. As I lay down that night, the memory of that voice echoed in my mind, keeping sleep at bay. Just as I was drifting off, I thought I heard it again, a faint whisper in my ear. Come back. The locked car posted by You Throwaway 7875. This happened a few years ago, but it still keeps me up at night. I'm sharing it here because I haven't been able to shake off the feeling of dread that it left me with. I need to get it out, so maybe I can finally put it behind me. I'm just a regular guy, working a regular job. My life is pretty uneventful most of the time. But that weekend, I was feeling overwhelmed. Work had been rough, and I needed a break. So, I decided to take a short road trip. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to clear my head and drive. I stopped at a rest area, one of those small, isolated ones you see on the side of highways, to stretch my legs and grab a quick snack before getting back on the road. The place was weirdly quiet. There were no other cars, just an old picnic table covered in graffiti, a single trash can, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The asphalt was cracked, and the air felt heavy. I remember hesitating before getting out, wondering if I should just keep driving, but I brushed it off. Don't be paranoid, I told myself. It's just a rest area. When I came back to the car, I reached into my pocket for the keys and froze. My pockets were empty. I dropped my bag and checked the ground around me, thinking I might have dropped them. Then I saw them, sitting right there on the driver's seat inside my locked car. My heart sank. I tried every door, but they were all securely locked. I was stuck outside in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, it was inside the car too, and no idea what to do. I was just starting to panic when a voice behind me made me jump. Need some help? I turned around to see a man standing there. I hadn't heard him approach. He looked friendly enough, average height, maybe mid-40s, wearing a baseball cap and a faded t-shirt. I was hesitant, but what could I do? I was locked out, and there was no one else around. Yeah, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. I locked my keys in. He nodded, his eyes flicking to my car and then back to me. Happens to the best of us. I've got a coat hanger in my trunk. We could use that to pop the lock. Something about his smile made my skin crawl, but I pushed the feeling down. I told myself I was just being paranoid again. He was offering to help, right? And I needed help. So I agreed. As he walked to his car to get the hanger, I couldn't help but notice the way he kept glancing back at me. My stomach tightened, but I stayed where I was. I felt trapped. When he returned, he started working on the lock, but it seemed to be taking a long time. He kept talking, asking questions about where I was headed, what I did for a living, things that felt too personal for a stranger to ask. I tried to give short answers, hoping he'd just focus on unlocking the door, but his eyes kept darting over to me, studying me. It felt like he was waiting for something. Got it almost open, he said after what felt like ages. He stepped back, scratching his head. I think I need something else from my car. Don't go anywhere. I nodded, my heart pounding. Where would I go? My phone was locked in the car, and I was alone with a stranger who was getting more unsettling by the minute. He came back with a different tool and looked me straight in the eye. You know, it's not safe out here by yourself. People have gone missing around these parts. My mouth went dry. I laughed nervously, trying to shrug it off. Yeah, I guess I should be more careful. He stepped closer. Tell you what, he said softly. I know a shortcut to town. Why don't you come with me, and we'll get someone to help? Alarm bells were blaring in my head now. No, it's fine, I managed. I'll just wait here. His face changed, something dark flickered across it, and he took another step closer. "You're making a mistake." Fear shot through me like ice water. I turned and started walking away, trying to keep it casual, but I could feel him right behind me. He called after me, his voice tight and angry. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" I didn't answer. I broke into a run. I heard him shout, and then heavy footsteps pounded behind me. He grabbed my arm and yanked me back so hard I stumbled. Panic surged through me, and I thrashed, screaming, but he was so much stronger than me. He shoved me down, pinning me with his knee. "Stop fighting," he hissed, his face twisted with irritation, like I was inconveniencing him. He didn't even seem angry, just annoyed. That made it worse somehow. With every bit of strength I had, I reached out blindly, grabbed a small rock, and swung it at his head. He grunted and stumbled back. I didn't wait to see if he was okay. I scrambled up and ran, crashing through the woods behind the rest area. Branches whipped at my face, tearing at my clothes, but I kept running. I could hear him behind me, cursing and crashing through the underbrush. I tripped and fell into a ditch, lying there gasping, trying to stay silent. I heard him stop just a few feet away. "I know you're out here," he called out. "You can't hide forever." I bit my lip to keep from sobbing. After what felt like hours, his footsteps faded. I stayed in that ditch until I was sure he was gone. My entire body was shaking as I crawled out and crept back to the rest area. My car door was open. The keys were gone. With no phone, no keys, and no way to call for help, I started walking toward the highway. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him step out of the trees. I never did, but I never felt safe again either. I didn't see the man again. My car was found abandoned a few days later in a town miles away. But sometimes, late at night, I'll see a passing car and think I recognize his face behind the wheel. I still don't know what he wanted, and I hope I never find out. Title: The Intruder at the Window. I don't know why I'm sharing this here, but I'm out of options. I need to feel like I'm not alone. I've never posted before, so bear with me if this comes out jumbled. About a year ago, I moved into a small, single-story house on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was supposed to be a fresh start after a tough breakup. I work from home, so I rarely leave the house. It's not that I'm a recluse, I just enjoy the peace and quiet. My house has large windows, which let in plenty of natural light during the day. But at night they make me feel exposed, like anyone could be watching from outside. It all started with a small, almost unnoticeable detail. A faint scratching noise at my bedroom window every few nights. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just tree branches swaying in the wind or maybe a stray cat. I didn't pay much attention. I've always been cautious, though. I lock my doors and windows every night. One evening, I noticed something strange. A small garden trowel I left by the window was missing. I brushed it off, assuming I misplaced it, but it left me feeling uneasy. Then, the scratching became more frequent. It seemed to happen at the same time every night, around 2 a.m. I would lie in bed, straining to hear it over the silence. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I started to worry. One night, I stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing near the bushes. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing my window. I scrambled back, heart pounding. When I finally gathered the courage to peek again, it was gone. I turned on all the lights and called the police. They arrived quickly, but by then, there was no trace of anyone outside. The officers were nice, but told me it was probably a trick of the light or shadows. They recommended better lighting around the house and said I shouldn't worry. I felt stupid and paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. Items I was sure I left in one place would show up somewhere else. A window I knew I locked was slightly open one morning. I tried to convince myself that I was just being forgetful or clumsy. Maybe the stress of the recent breakup was getting to me. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too scared to sleep. The scratching started, followed by a soft tap, tap, tap on the glass. It was deliberate, like someone was knocking, but trying not to make too much noise. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't dare move or even breathe too loudly. The tapping continued for a few minutes and then stopped. The next morning, I found muddy footprints outside my bedroom window. They led up to the glass and then trailed away into the garden. I called the police again. They looked around but couldn't find anything useful. One of the officers suggested I get better locks and maybe install security cameras. I felt helpless. I had the camera set up the next day, covering all the windows and doors. I spent hours watching the footage, expecting to see something. But for a while, there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone coming near the house. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. Then, one morning, I found a piece of paper slipped under my front door. It had just 3 words on it. I see you. I felt a wave of nausea. Someone had been here, right at my front door. I called the police again, but without fingerprints or evidence, they couldn't do much. They suggested I stay with a friend for a few days to clear my head. Desperation set in. That night, I sat up watching the cameras, knife clutched in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I saw it. A figure creeping toward my bedroom window. It moved slowly, as if knowing I was watching. I reached for my phone to call the police, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a window being forced open. I grabbed the knife and hid in my closet, shaking uncontrollably. I heard footsteps moving through the house, quiet, methodical. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I covered my mouth, holding my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps came closer. I squeezed my eyes shut as they stopped right outside the closet door. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and desperate. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. I heard the back door open and then close. It took me almost an hour to come out. When the police arrived, they found clear signs of forced entry, but nothing was taken. The security footage showed the figure entering the house, walking through each room, then standing in the living room, staring directly at the camera for a full minute before leaving. The police told me to stay somewhere else for a while. I felt violated, exposed. I packed a bag and went to stay at a friend's place across town. But even there, I couldn't escape the fear. I kept checking the security footage on my phone. I started getting strange calls, heavy breathing on the other end, followed by silence. I'd hang up, but it left me shaking every time. One day, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of me asleep in my friend's guest room. The picture was taken from outside the window. The text read, "You can't hide forever." I don't know what to do anymore. I'm considering quitting my job and moving to a new city. But what if he finds me again? I've tried everything, police reports, cameras, staying with friends. Nothing works. I'm not the same person I was. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Sometimes I still hear scratching noises at night, even though I'm miles away from my old house. Sometimes I wonder if he's already inside. The Forgotten Birthday. I'm not sure why I'm posting this, but I guess I just need to get it out. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't shake off the feeling it left me with. It was a Thursday. My birthday, actually. Not that anyone at work remembered. I didn't really care. I'm not one for parties or attention. But I guess it would have been nice if someone had said something. Just another long day at the office, pushing papers and dealing with petty issues. By the time I finally left, It was past 9 p.m., and I just wanted to get home to my wife and kid. I took my usual route, a quiet drive through mostly empty streets. There was something oddly comforting about the familiar turns, the stretch of road lined with streetlights casting long shadows. As I drove, I heard a faint metallic clinking noise. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just something loose in the car, maybe a tool I'd left in the trunk. I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed a dark-colored sedan a few cars behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I turned off onto the smaller roads leading to my neighborhood, I noticed it again, closer this time. Still, I figured it was nothing. Lots of people live in the area. As I took a turn onto a quieter road, something about the car's movements caught my attention. It wasn't just following me, it was mimicking my every move. I turned left. It turned left. I slowed down, and so did it. I sped up slightly, testing it, and sure enough, it did the same. My heart rate picked up, and a knot of unease formed in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were heading the same way. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. I took a sudden, sharp right turn onto a street I'd never gone down before, and when I glanced in the mirror, the sedan was right there, keeping pace. Every hair on my neck stood on end. This wasn't normal. I switched lanes abruptly, slowing down, then speeding up. The car did the same. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I stole another glance at my phone. I wanted to call my wife, but I didn't want to freak her out, not yet. My mind was racing. Had I cut someone off earlier? Was this road rage? But if it was, why weren't they getting closer? Why weren't they honking or flashing their lights? I turned onto a dead-end street, hoping, no, praying, that the car would keep going straight. But it didn't. It followed me right into the dead end and stopped a few feet behind me. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I stared at the shadowy figure in the driver's seat through my rearview mirror. They weren't moving, just watching. I didn't know what to do. Get out and confront them? What if they had a weapon? But staying put didn't feel like an option either. I shifted into reverse, backing out slowly, then hit the gas. The sedan moved too, keeping just enough distance to make it clear it wasn't going to leave me alone. My mind was spinning. I had to get somewhere public, somewhere safe. There was a gas station a few miles ahead, and I made a beeline for it, hoping that the lights and cameras would deter whoever was in that car. I pulled in sharply, parking right in front of the store. My heart was slamming against my ribs as I watched the sedan pull in behind me, but not as close this time. It stayed back, its headlights casting a harsh glow. I considered running inside, but something held me back. Curiosity? Fear? I don't know. My hands were trembling as I kept my eyes fixed on the car. Then, the driver's door slowly opened, and a man stepped out. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s. He didn't seem threatening, just cautious. He approached my car, and I thought about driving off, but I couldn't move. There was something in his demeanor that stopped me. He looked like he was trying to figure out how to approach without scaring me more. "Hey man," he called out, his voice muffled through the glass. "I just wanted to let you know, you left something on your roof." I frowned, not sure I'd heard him right. "What?" "Your wallet," he said, pointing to the top of my car. I hesitated, but then slowly stepped out, keeping my distance. Sure enough, perched on the roof was my wallet. My mind reeled as I grabbed it, my hands clammy and shaky. "How the hell? You, drove off from the coffee shop with it up there," the man explained, smiling awkwardly. "I tried to get your attention back there, but you didn't notice. Followed you all the way here to make sure no one stole it." Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a heavy dose of embarrassment. My paranoia, the fear, the dead-end street, all because I'd been an idiot and left my wallet on the roof. I muttered a thank you, checking the wallet, Everything was there. The man gave me a nod and headed back to his car. Take care, man. Just be more careful. I watched as he got in and drove off. For a long moment, I just stood there, feeling the adrenaline drain out of me. I climbed back into my car, still shaking. It felt surreal. One minute, I was convinced I was about to be attacked, and the next, I was just a guy who'd forgotten his wallet. I drove home slowly, replaying the events over and over in my head. Fear had completely clouded my judgment, turning a simple mistake into something terrifying. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I let out a long breath. Everything was fine. I was fine. Before I went inside, I glanced at my phone. There was a missed call from my wife. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the call log. Something about it made me uneasy, but I shook it off and went in. My wife and son were already asleep. I put the wallet on the kitchen counter and headed to the bathroom, splashing water on my face. When I looked up, I noticed something small but strange. My wife's car keys were on the counter. She never leaves them out. It made my heart skip a beat. Was it just a coincidence? Was the guy really just trying to help? I glanced at the front door, making sure it was locked before heading to bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. I've always been cautious about driving alone at night. Living in a small town with quiet roads and long stretches of nothing between houses, it just seemed smart. I'd usually try to finish up work before it got too dark, but that night, I had to stay late. By the time I got out, the parking lot was almost empty, just my car and one other, parked oddly close to the entrance with no one inside. There was something unsettling in the air, like an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. The roads were emptier than usual, and the few cars I did see passed by quickly, as if they were in a hurry to get somewhere safe. Maybe it was because of the recent reports of people going missing in the area. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw her, a girl, standing on the side of the road, her figure barely visible in the faint glow of my headlights. She couldn't have been more than 14 or 15. Instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but she looked so out of place, so vulnerable. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and stopped a few feet ahead of her. She climbed in without a word, slipping into the back seat. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror, but her face was hidden by a curtain of long hair. "Where are you heading?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space of the car. The girl didn't speak. She just pointed straight ahead. Something about her silence felt off, but I shrugged it off as shyness. We drove on, the silence thick and suffocating. I tried to make small talk, asking if she was okay, if she needed help, but got no response. Her hand stayed clenched in her lap, her head bowed down like she was studying something. The unease I'd felt earlier deepened. I glanced at her in the mirror again, but I couldn't see her face clearly. In fact, it was almost as if she wasn't really there. The reflection was blurred, like when you look at something through fog glass. I blinked hard, but nothing changed. I must be tired, I thought, rubbing my eyes and focusing back on the road. "Are you sure you don't want me to drop you off somewhere specific?" I asked again, trying to shake off the tension building inside me. She didn't reply, but when I looked back at her, I realized she hadn't moved an inch since she'd gotten in. My heart started pounding. The air felt heavier, thicker. I rolled down the window slightly, hoping the breeze would calm me, but it didn't. The girl's presence felt almost oppressive now, filling up the car in a way that made it hard to breathe. I was about to pull over and ask her to get out when she finally moved. She lifted her head and pointed forward again. Just ahead, I noticed a faint glow, a car parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. The parked car looked abandoned. The doors were closed, but something about it seemed wrong. The girl didn't look up, didn't say anything. She just kept pointing. Maybe this was where she wanted to go? I pulled over, my hands shaking as I put the car in park. Is this where you want to get out? I asked, turning around. The back seat was empty. My mind froze. She couldn't have gotten out. There hadn't been time. I whipped around, staring into the darkness outside. There was no one. No sound of a door opening or closing. No footsteps. Just nothing. A cold wave of panic crashed over me. I stumbled out of the car, looking around frantically, but the girl was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I ran to the other car, peering inside. It was empty too, but on the passenger seat I saw a small backpack, the kind a young girl would carry to school. My hands felt numb as I opened the door and picked it up. There was a notebook inside, and on the cover was a name scribbled in childish handwriting. Emily. That was when I heard it, a soft, faint tapping from somewhere close by. It was coming from my car. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned around, looking at the passenger side window. There was no one there, but my radio crackled to life. The static filled the car, and then I heard it, a whisper, so clear it felt like someone was sitting right next to me. "Thank you for bringing me home." I froze, my eyes darting around wildly. There was no one, just an empty car on a dark, deserted road. My heart hammered in my chest as I scrambled back to my car, tossing the backpack onto the passenger seat. I sped away, not daring to look back, the whisper still echoing in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that girl's blurred reflection in the mirror. By morning, I convinced myself it was a hallucination, stress and exhaustion playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to call the police and report what happened. When I described the girl and the abandoned car, the officer on the other end went silent. "That car, a girl matching your description, has been missing for over a week. We found her backpack and notebook in an abandoned vehicle just like you described," he said slowly. "But how did you know about those items? That information was never released." My mouth went dry. I didn't have an answer. The officer asked me to come in for more questions, but I hung up, too stunned to think straight. I don't drive alone at night anymore. I can't. Every time I get behind the wheel, I hear that voice, whispering softly, as if she's still there waiting for me to take her somewhere. I don't know if Emily ever got home. I don't know if she was real, or if I imagined the whole thing. But there's one thing I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. That voice saying, "Thank you for bringing me home." The voice in the woods. I'm not exactly what you call an experienced camper. I've been out in the woods a few times with friends, but never alone. But after the breakup, I needed some space. Some real space. No phone, no people, just me and my thoughts. So I decided to spend the weekend camping by myself, far from everything. I found this remote spot off a deserted highway. The campsite was surrounded by thick woods with a small clearing where I could set up my tent. No cell phone signal, no nearby campsites, just what I needed. As I drove there, I passed an empty car parked on the side of the road. It looked abandoned, but I shrugged it off. A few minutes later, I spotted a freshly dug hole near the trailhead. It seemed out of place, but I ignored it. Maybe it was some animal's doing. The first couple of hours at the campsite were peaceful. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and just sat there, letting the silence settle in. As the sun set, though, a faint rustling sound came from the woods. I froze. Probably just some animal. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but it felt deliberate, like something moving towards me, then stopping. While cooking dinner over the fire, I started hearing it, faint whispers from the woods. They were low and muffled, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I told myself it was the wind moving through the trees. I tried playing some music from my phone, but it died almost instantly, even though I'd fully charged it before I left. Great. Blaming the cold for the battery drain, I put it away. I turned back to my tent, and that's when I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper lying at the entrance. It wasn't there before. I picked it up, but it was blank. No writing, no markings, just a blank sheet. It could have blown in from somewhere, I reasoned, but there wasn't a breeze. A strange feeling settled over me, but I shook it off. As the forest became pitch dark, the whispers grew louder. Every time I shined my flashlight into the woods, they stopped. But the second I turned away, they'd start again, closer, and always in that same low murmur. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it felt wrong. I decided to call it a night and turned in early, hoping sleep would help calm my nerves. As I zipped up the tent, I heard it, my name, whispered softly from just outside. My heart hammered in my chest. It couldn't be real. I told myself it was just the wind, just my tired mind playing tricks. But it was getting harder and harder to believe that. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear those damn whispers again. And then footsteps, soft, crunching footsteps, circling my tent. I lay there, eyes wide open, straining to hear. Whoever, whatever it was moving slowly, deliberately. At one point, something heavy bumped against the side of my tent. I shot up, pulse racing, no more ignoring it. I had to get out of there. I threw on my boots and stumbled out, heading straight for my car. But when I got there, I felt my stomach drop. All 4 tires were slashed, deep, clean cuts. No way an animal did this. I tried my phone again, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic started creeping in. I could walk, but it'd take hours to reach the main road, and I wasn't sure I'd make it in the dark. I stumbled back to the campsite, feeling exposed, like I was being watched from every direction. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. And then I heard it again. My name, clearer now, from deep in the woods. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder, angrier this time. I backed away, nearly tripping over a log. A rustling sound from the underbrush made me freeze. I pointed the flashlight toward it, and there it was, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My mouth went dry as I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. The figure stepped forward, just enough for me to see. My blood ran cold. It was wearing my clothes I'd left in the tent. I slowly backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't follow, but just watched as I retreated. Back at the campfire, I frantically piled more wood onto the flames, making the fire burn brighter. I needed the light. I needed to see. I sat with my back to a tree, pocket knife in hand, eyes scanning the woods. Who were they? Why were they doing this? That's when I noticed it. A small camcorder, perched on a branch, pointed right at me. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed it, my hands trembling. The last clip was of me, sitting at the fire. It was filmed from right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. They'd been here all along, just out of my sight. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I stayed up all night, knife in hand, fire blazing. The whispers stopped, but the silence was worse. Every so often I thought I saw movement, but it was always just out of reach. Finally, the sky began to lighten. The whispers ceased completely. I dared to close my eyes for just a second, but when I opened them again, there was a new note beside me. See you again. I packed up and left at first light, adrenaline still coursing through me. I made it to the main road and flagged down a passing car. I tried to explain everything to the local police, but they found no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no camcorder, nothing. They chalked it up to some prank, and I couldn't prove otherwise. A few days later, I got into my car to drive to work. My missing clothes were neatly folded on the back seat. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where I lived. The unfinished conversation. I guess you could say everything was fine until the phone call started. I used to be someone with a pretty predictable life, a small apartment, a steady job as a graphic designer, and a regular routine. Most evenings, I'd be alone, working on freelance projects or binge watching TV shows. I'm not really the social type. Plus, I was going through a rough breakup, so I preferred to be by myself. It was a few weeks after my ex and I split that I got the first call. It was late around midnight, and I remember glancing at the screen. No caller ID. I assumed it was a wrong number and ignored it. The next day, it happened again. I answered, but no one spoke. Just silence. I thought maybe it was a technical issue, so I hung up. But the calls kept coming. 2, sometimes 3 times a day. Each time, silence. I brushed it off, thinking it was some kind of prank, but it left me feeling unsettled, and deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Then one night, I swear I heard faint breathing on the other end. It was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But that night, I barely slept. The call started to mess with me more than I'd like to admit. I'd stay up late, staring at my phone, waiting for it to light up with another call. My heart would race every time it did. During the day, I'd be anxious, distracted at work, avoiding going out. The sense of unease crept into every part of my life. I couldn't focus. I couldn't relax. After a particularly disturbing call that jolted me awake at 2 a.m., I decided enough was enough. I changed my number, hoping that would be the end of it. For a few days, there was blissful silence. No weird calls, no creepy midnight interruptions. I thought I was free. But then, my phone rang again. No caller ID. I answered, and this time, the silence was broken by a quiet exhale. It was as if whoever was on the other end wanted me to know they were there, listening. Panic washed over me. Who could have gotten my new number? Only my closest friends and family knew it. It wasn't just some random prank anymore. Someone was watching me. My mind raced. Was it my ex? A friend with a sick sense of humor? Or worse, had I caught the attention of a stranger who wouldn't leave me alone? I tried to block the calls, using every app I could find, but somehow they kept slipping through. I started noticing a pattern. If I mentioned going to the grocery store, I'd get a call as soon as I stepped inside. If I said I was feeling uneasy at night, I'd get a call right after I turned off my bedroom light. The calls weren't random. They followed me. I started recording them, desperate to capture anything that might help me figure out who was doing this. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone and screamed into it, demanding to know who they were, what they wanted. Silence. And then, a faint, barely audible chuckle. I took the recordings to the police, but they were useless. Without any direct threats or harassment, they brushed it off as a nuisance call case. They said it was probably just some tech glitch or a bored prankster. I felt helpless. Days passed, and I started avoiding my phone entirely. I'd turn it off for hours, trying to reclaim some sense of control. But then I got an email. No subject line, no sender I could trace. Just one sentence. I miss hearing your voice. I felt sick. It wasn't a stranger anymore. This person knew too much. They had my new number, my email. They were always one step ahead. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag and moved in with a friend. I changed my number again, deleted my email account, and erased every trace of my social media presence. I wanted to vanish, become unreachable. For a while, I felt a sense of relief. No more calls, no strange emails, just silence. Days went by, and I started to believe it was over. Then, one evening, sitting alone in my friend's living room, my new phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Nice haircut. My heart stopped. I had just gotten a haircut that morning. Only my friend and the stylist knew. I looked around the empty room, feeling eyes on me even though I was alone. Panic set in. I ran to the windows, checking the locks, peeking through the blinds. But the street outside was empty. I started pacing, the tension in my chest almost unbearable. How did they know? Where were they watching me from? The silence in the room felt deafening, pressing down on me. My hands were shaking as I dialed my friend's number, but before I could hit call, I saw something, a shadow shifting outside the window. I rushed over, yanking the blinds up, but there was no one there. Just the empty, quiet street. I was gasping for breath, knowing deep down that whoever it was, they were closer than I'd ever imagined. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was losing it, letting my fear turn into paranoia, but I knew the truth. It was real, and I wasn't safe. I thought about calling the police again, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. So I sat there, a wreck, jumping at every creak, every passing car. My phone buzzed one last time. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The message read, "You should smile more. I'll see you soon." I stared at the screen, paralyzed. They weren't just watching from afar. They were close, close enough to see me, to know my every move. So that's where I am now. I'm living in constant fear, unsure what to do next. I've thought about leaving town, changing my identity, but I know it's probably pointless. Whoever this is, they know too much. I don't answer my phone anymore. I don't check emails. I barely sleep. I'm always listening, waiting for the next sign that they're still out there, watching. The calls have stopped, but the silence is worse. Maybe I'll never know who it was or why they chose me, but that's what keeps me awake at night, not knowing if it's really over or if it's just beginning. The out-of-town motel, a night I'll never forget. I travel a lot for work. Most of the time, it's pretty straightforward. Fly out, meet the clients, stay at a decent hotel, and head back. But one night, I found myself on a long, empty highway somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I was exhausted, and it was getting late, so I decided to pull into the first motel I saw. The sign was barely lit, flickering in and out, and the place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in years, but I was too tired to be picky. As I parked my car, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. The parking lot was empty, and the office looked deserted. I almost turned around, but my eyes caught a shadow moving behind one of the windows in the supposedly empty rooms. It's just my imagination, I told myself, convincing myself it was just fatigue. I headed inside, paid for the room, and walked over to the dimly lit hallway leading to my door. The room wasn't much better. It looked like it had been cleaned quickly. Drawers were slightly open, an empty hanger swung slowly in the closet, and there was a faint, musty smell lingering in the air. I tried to ignore these details, thinking it was just a run-down place, and locked the door behind me. I unpacked and was about to lie down when I heard it, a faint murmur and the sound of something creaking outside. I walked over to the window, pulled back the curtain slightly, but saw nothing. The parking lot was as empty as before, but when I opened the door to get a better look, I saw a light switch off a few rooms down. Goosebumps rose on my arms. I stepped back inside and locked the door again, Right then, the phone rang. It was from the front desk. "Hello?" I answered, but there was no response, just faint breathing, and then a soft creak, like a door opening slowly. I hung up, my heart pounding. Something was definitely off. I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I turned on the TV to break the silence, but I kept the volume low. Minutes turned into hours, and the unease settled deep in my bones. I started to notice movement outside the window again. Someone was pacing back and forth. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. Peeking through a tiny gap in the curtains, I saw a pair of eyes staring directly at me from the room across. I stumbled back, almost knocking over the nightstand. The knock on the door came right after, quiet at first, then louder. My mouth went dry, and my hands started to tremble. Slowly, I walked to the door and asked who it was. "Hey man, sorry to bother you, but do you have any food to spare?" "I'm in the next room," a voice answered. The guy looked normal enough when I opened the door. He was smiling, too wide, too friendly. Everything about him felt off. I told him I didn't have anything and started to close the door, but he didn't move. His eyes darted around the room behind me, and he stayed rooted to the spot, smiling that same unsettling smile. "All right, no problem," he finally said. He turned and walked away, but not before glancing over his shoulder one last time. I locked the door and picked up the phone to call the front desk again. No answer. I glanced outside. The office lights were off. The whole place looked deserted. Panic set in. I started packing up my things, deciding to leave, but just as I was about to grab my bag, I heard voices. Low, muffled whispers, right outside my door. I crept to the peephole and looked out. 3 people were standing there, facing my door, talking in a language I didn't understand. I backed away, pulse racing, and called 911. The operator picked up, but as soon as I started explaining my situation, the voices outside got louder, like they could hear me through the walls. "They're outside my room. I don't know what they want," I whispered frantically. "Stay calm, sir. We're sending a patrol car," the operator replied. I hung up and waited, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Then, the knocking started again, this time more forceful, almost shaking the door on its hinges. I retreated to the bathroom, heart hammering. The voices grew louder, then abruptly stopped. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously came out. There was a note slipped under my door. My hand shook as I picked it up. "We're just filming. Come join us." Filming? I didn't know what to think. My head was spinning. I looked outside the window and saw a van pulling away. The side of it had the words "Film Crew" printed in bold letters. The people outside were getting in and driving off like it was all some kind of twisted joke. Shaking, I opened the door and stepped out into the empty hallway. The manager's office door was ajar. Inside, I found a mess of papers, scripts, room assignments. It was all part of some low-budget film project. But the place was deserted now. There wasn't a single person left. When the police arrived, I showed them what I found. They did a quick search and confirmed that it looked like a set used for filming. "Looks like they packed up and left in a hurry," one of the officers said. They took my statement and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. Even after I got home, I couldn't sleep properly for days. Every creak of my house, every shadow that shifted outside my window made my skin crawl. I later found out that the motel was rented out by independent filmmakers. The note? A mistake meant for one of their actors. But the dread of that night still lingers, and I can't help but feel it was more than just a misunderstanding. I've even received emails from them since, asking if I'd be interested in appearing in the next shoot. I don't know how they got my email. I blocked them, but sometimes I still get the messages. I wish I'd just kept driving that night. The noises in the basement. I've been thinking a lot lately about something that happened to me a few years ago. It's not something I like to talk about, but recent news has brought it all back, and I can't get it out of my head. So I decided to share it here, hoping it might help me process everything. Back then, I was living in a small, old apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The rent was cheap and it was close to my work, so it seemed like a good deal. The building wasn't in great shape, peeling paint, creaky floors, and a faint, musty smell that never really went away, but it was quiet, and most of my neighbors kept to themselves. I figured I could deal with the little quirks. Things were fine for the first few months. Then, I started hearing noises at night. At first, it was just the occasional creak or thud, which I brushed off as normal sounds in an old building. But then it got weirder. There were distinct noises coming from the basement, soft footsteps, a strange rhythmic tapping, sometimes even what sounded like a faint scraping. I mentioned it to my landlord, who just shrugged and said it was probably the old plumbing acting up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard it again. Footsteps, unmistakable this time, moving around beneath me. It wasn't the clanging of pipes or the usual settling noises. It was someone's feet, shuffling slowly back and forth. My heart pounded and I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to check it out for myself. I waited until the afternoon, when I knew most people would be at work. I went down to the basement and noticed the door was slightly open. That was strange because the landlord always kept it locked. I hesitated for a second, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The basement was dimly lit and cluttered with old boxes and broken furniture. But what caught my attention was a small corner at the back. There, on the concrete floor, were a few empty food containers, a crumpled blanket, and a flashlight. It looked like someone had been living down there. My skin prickled as I realized what I was seeing. I took a few quick pictures with my phone and hurried back upstairs. When I showed the pictures to my landlord, he seemed unfazed. Probably just some old stuff from when we had a homeless problem a few years ago, he said casually. He assured me there was nothing to worry about and promised to clean it up later. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. As I left the basement, the door swung shut behind me with a heavy thud, even though there was no draft. Over the next few weeks, the noises grew louder and more frequent. They seemed to echo through the walls, always at odd hours of the night. My sleep was a mess, and I started feeling like I was being watched whenever I walked past the basement door. One night, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound coming from below. I pressed my ear to the floor and listened. The tapping stopped abruptly. Then, I heard it. Someone chuckling softly. I recoiled, heart pounding. There was no way I was imagining this. I considered calling the police, but hesitated. What would I even say? Instead, I decided to set up a recording device in my living room, hoping to capture the noises as proof. The next morning, I played back the recording. For hours, there was nothing but silence. Then, at around 3 a.m., the noises started, shuffling footsteps, a faint murmur of voices, and at one point, a low, guttural laugh that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just pipes or an old building settling. Someone was down there. I confronted my landlord again, and this time, his response was different. He seemed tense, even a little defensive. He insisted there was no one in the basement and told me I was overreacting. I didn't buy it. When I passed by the basement door later that day, I noticed he'd put a new, heavy-duty lock on it. He hadn't mentioned it, and it felt like he was hiding something. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps directly below me. They were louder, more erratic, like someone was pacing frantically. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. Then, there was a creak right outside my door. I froze, holding my breath. I thought about running, but where would I go? I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed a bag and started packing quietly. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a soft knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I tiptoed to the peephole and looked out. Nothing. Then I heard it. A whisper. Someone was calling my name. I panicked and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom while I waited. They arrived quickly and searched the entire building, including the basement. They found no one, but there were clear signs that someone had been living down there. Fresh food wrappers, personal items, and a bed made of old blankets hidden behind a stack of boxes. The landlord claimed ignorance and said he'd call a locksmith to secure the place. I didn't wait around to see what happened next. I moved out within a few days, staying with friends until I found a new place. As I was leaving, I glanced back at the basement window and thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. When I looked again, it was gone. Months later, I came across a news article about my old building. The police had arrested a wanted criminal hiding in the basement, someone who'd been on the run for years. The article mentioned that he'd been living there for months, maybe longer. I felt sick reading it. I'd been living above this person the whole time, hearing him move around, and I hadn't done anything. The thought that I might have crossed paths with him or even spoken to him without knowing who he was still haunts me. How many times had I been inches away from danger? I'll never know, but I can't stop wondering what might have happened if I hadn't moved out when I did. The lurker at the bus stop. Hi Reddit. I'm not sure if I'm overreacting or if I'm really in danger, but I feel like I need to share this somewhere. Maybe you all can give me some advice or at least tell me I'm not going crazy. My name is Emily, and I'm a college student living in a small city. I've always thought of myself as someone who's pretty aware of her surroundings. I take the bus to and from my university every day. It's not something I ever had an issue with, until recently. About a week ago, I noticed a man at my bus stop. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him, but this time felt different. He was standing there, not waiting for the bus, just standing. He didn't do anything, didn't talk to me, but I felt his eyes on me the whole time. When the bus arrived, he didn't get on, just watched as I boarded. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I mean, he didn't even approach me or say anything. But then, it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Every evening, he'd be there, watching, always a little too close. Every time I glanced his way, I found him staring back at me, expressionless. He never got on the bus, just stayed there, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Last night, it went from unsettling to terrifying. I stayed late at the university library to work on a project. It was dark by the time I left, and the campus was nearly empty. I felt nervous walking alone, but when I got closer to the bus stop, I saw him again. He was already there, like he knew I'd be coming. As soon as I stopped to grab a drink from the convenience store across the street, I saw him cross over. He stood just outside, staring in. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe he was just a guy hanging out or waiting for someone. But when I walked back to the bus stop, he followed, keeping a few steps behind me. I took out my phone, pretending to text, hoping it would make me look less vulnerable. When the bus finally arrived, I couldn't get on fast enough. I looked back as we pulled away, expecting to see him walking away too, but he just stood there, staring at the bus, watching me leave. That's when I realized this wasn't a coincidence. Tonight, I decided to change my routine. I went to a different bus stop, one that's further away. I thought I'd be safe, that I'd lose him. When I stepped onto the bus, I felt a small wave of relief until I saw him sitting at the back. My heart dropped. He was there, on my bus, staring directly at me. How did he know I'd be here? Did he follow me again, or was this just some horrible twist of fate? I took a seat near the front, pretending I didn't notice him. but I couldn't stop looking back at his reflection in the window. Every time I glanced over, his eyes were on me, cold, unblinking. I wanted to get off, but I was afraid. What if he followed me home? What if he already knew where I lived? When the bus reached my stop, I hesitated. Should I stay and ride it out, or risk him knowing where I live? At the last second, I jumped off, my heart pounding so hard it felt like I couldn't breathe. I thought maybe he'd stay on the bus, but he didn't. He got off too. I started walking fast, almost running, but tried to make it look casual. I called a friend and asked them to stay on the line with me. I didn't want to sound dramatic, so I didn't tell them what was happening. I just needed to hear someone's voice. I turned the corner, glancing back every few seconds. He wasn't there. Finally, I breathed a sigh of relief. I must have lost him, but as I turned another corner, there he was, just standing under a streetlight, waiting for me. I froze. He didn't move, just kept staring. My mind raced. I needed to do something. I ran into a nearby 24-hour grocery store, hoping he wouldn't follow, but he did. I pretended to browse the aisles, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. The cashier gave me a strange look, but I didn't say anything. What was I supposed to do? Say, "Help, a guy's following me"? Would anyone believe me? I peeked towards the entrance, and there he was, just standing near the door. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I wanted to call the police, but what would I even tell them? A man is watching me didn't sound serious enough, so I waited. It felt like forever. When a group of people came in, I slipped out with them, staying close. I walked quickly, looking over my shoulder until I was sure I didn't see him anymore. I kept walking, nearly running, until I reached my apartment building. I'm home now. I checked every corner of the street before I came in, made sure no one was behind me. I locked every door and window. I want to believe I'm safe, but I can't stop shaking. Did I imagine it all? Maybe I overreacted. Maybe he was just some random guy and I'm freaking out for no reason. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're good at running, but I'll catch up." I'm staring at the screen now, my fingers numb. I don't know what to do. Should I call the police? Will they even believe me? I posted this because I don't know what else to do. I'm scared, but I don't want to be one of those people who just overreacts. As I'm typing this, there's a knock at my door. It's almost midnight. No one should be here. I don't know what to do. The silent caller. I'm not sure why I'm even writing this. Maybe it's because I'm desperate, or maybe I just need to know that I'm not crazy. Either way, if you're reading this and have gone through something similar, please share it here. I really need to know if I'm alone in this. It all started about 3 months ago, right after my girlfriend broke up with me. I was already in a pretty low place, living alone in a small apartment in the suburbs. I spent my evenings scrolling through Netflix, trying to distract myself. Nothing seemed unusual at first, until I started getting these random voicemails. At first, they were just short, silent recordings from an unknown number. I thought they were accidental, like a glitch in the system, but they kept coming, and always when I was alone. They never happened when I was talking to someone or out in public. Still, I didn't think too much of it. Just some weird bug, right? That's what I told myself. Then, about a month ago, I got a voicemail at work. Expecting it to be another blank recording, I played it. What I heard chilled me to the bone. It was a recording of a conversation I'd had in my living room the night before. I remember that night vividly. I'd been talking to my friend Steve over a cup of coffee. But Steve's voice on the recording was muffled, barely audible, while mine was crystal clear. Every clink of my mug, every word I said, it was all there. My heart pounded as I replayed it over and over. How could this be possible? My phone hadn't been in the same room as us, and I hadn't made any calls during that time. I was sure someone must have hacked my device. I immediately called my service provider, explaining everything, but they couldn't find any record of the number that had left the voicemail. Nothing. I was told to change my number, so I did. For a few days, everything seemed fine, and I began to relax. Then, it happened again. This time, I was alone in my bedroom, working on my laptop. The new voicemail was a perfect recording of me typing away in complete silence. No background noise, no music, just the rhythmic sound of keys being pressed. I hadn't even spoken during that time, yet somehow, someone had recorded me. I felt a wave of nausea and fear. Someone was watching me, listening to me, but I couldn't figure out how. My apartment didn't have any obvious cameras or bugs, and I never noticed anyone suspicious outside. Was I losing my mind? I started tearing the place apart, searching every inch for hidden devices. I even called in a professional to sweep my apartment for bugs. He didn't find anything. By then, I was jumping at every creak and shadow, too afraid to even sleep properly. I went to the police, but they just shrugged it off as a prank call. They said that without any tangible evidence, they couldn't do anything. The officer's disinterested look told me everything. He thought I was crazy. After that, I started keeping my blinds shut all the time and stopped inviting friends over. What if they got recorded too? One night, I decided to record myself while I slept. It was a stupid idea, but I had to know. The next morning, I woke up to another voicemail. My hands shook as I played it. The message was a recording of me sleeping. I could hear my own breathing, the soft rustling of sheets as I turned. There were no other sounds, no whispers or footsteps. But just knowing that someone had captured such a private moment made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up everything and moved to a new city, getting a different phone number yet again. I found a small house in a quiet neighborhood and tried to start fresh. For a few weeks, it worked. No voicemails, no strange occurrences. I almost convinced myself it was over. But just when I thought I was free, I got another voicemail. This time, it was a recording of me speaking to the realtor as I signed the lease for the new place. I could hear every word I said, the realtor's pen scratching against the paper, even the echo of my own voice in the empty room. I collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I realized it then. No matter where I went, whoever was doing this could always find me. They weren't following my phone. They were following me. I tried calling the police again, but stopped myself. What could they do? They dismissed me once, and they'd do it again. There was no evidence, no trail, just a series of voicemails from nowhere. My life spiraled out of control after that. I quit my job and barely left the house. I'd spend hours staring at my phone, terrified of when the next message would come. And then, yesterday, I received one final voicemail. My breath caught as I hit play. There was no recording of me this time, no conversation, no ambient noise, just a single word spoken in a low, gravelly voice. Closer. I don't know what it means, but I threw my phone in the trash right after. I haven't turned it on since, but it doesn't matter. I know I won't be safe even if I get rid of it. Whoever's behind this, they're out there. They've been watching, waiting, and now they're closer. I'm posting this here because I don't know what else to do. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Is there anything I can do to stop it? I don't want to move again. I'm too scared to even sleep. Edit. I just heard a knock at my door. There's no one there.